The wind hissed across the battlements of Dragonstone, carrying the briny scent of the narrow sea and a subtle promise of conflict yet to come. Night had fallen, but torches crackled along the walls, illuminating the ancient fortress and its winding stone steps carved centuries ago by the Targaryens of old. Varys stood upon a parapet overlooking the courtyard. His robes, thin as they were, billowed in the sea breeze, and though the air was chill, his hands did not tremble. He stared into the darkness, as though he might catch sight of distant sails or dragons in the skies. He was thinking, always thinking. Every whisper from the corridors, every wary glance among the soldiers, each fleeting rumor from the lips of frightened small folk in the towns nearby, they all gathered into a tapestry of meaning inside his mind. Daenerys, Stormborn of House Targaryen, breaker of chains and mother of dragons, was changing. His eyes had seen the lines of tension around her mouth. His ears had heard the pointed edge in her words, and he recognized the creeping shadows of paranoia forming like clouds across her once radiant presence. He did not like what he saw. He had pledged himself to the realm, always to the realm, and over the years that meant shifting allegiances when kings proved unworthy or dangerous. Now he faced a choice that filled him with a cold dread. Remain silent, even as Daenerys descended toward a madness reminiscent of her father's, or speak the truth that might dethrone a queen and cast the realm into open conflict again. He feared, though, if he waited too long, her dragons would unleash a terror the Seven Kingdoms could not endure. He left the parapet and walked quietly through the dim corridors of Dragonstone. By torchlight, carved reliefs of dragons loomed along the walls, dancing in molten shadows. He took measured steps. One might mistake him for a specter in the gloom. At last, he came to a modest chamber that served as his private study. An arched window looked onto the Black Sea, the faint glimmer of moonlight upon the waves offering more illumination than the single candle flickering on his desk. Papers were scattered across its surface. Letters from across the realm, names of lords and ladies who might be persuaded to shift their loyalty. Half-finished messages that Varys had not yet decided to send. Seated at the desk, he dipped the quill in ink and began to write. He needed to gather allies, or at least open lines of communication with those who were desperate for a stable future. But how to do it without inciting the wrath of Daenerys, whose temper was already smoldering? Varys composed a short note, an invitation to Lord Glover in the north, a man who had once been uncertain about bending the knee to House Targaryen. If Glover were reminded of the potential threat of Daenerys's rule, perhaps he would be more open to supporting an alternative. Yet not just Glover, others too. The Lords of the Vale, the recalcitrant Lords of the Reach who'd lost so much during the war, the River Lords who yearned for peace after the devastation of the Freys. He signed the note simply, with no name, only a small flourish shaped like a spider. His personal touch, should it reach the right hands. He left the letter unsent for the moment, wanting to draft more, each precisely directed to key individuals. But the hour was late, and though he seldom slept, he knew rest would grant him fresh perspective. He carefully stashed the unfinished notes away in a secret compartment beneath a loose flagstone. Such compartments were useful for ensuring certain letters disappeared if the castle guard decided to search his room. Then he blew out the candle. In the darkness, he sat for a moment, breathing evenly, reminding himself why he did what he did. It was all for the realm. Her father had been called the Mad King for good reason, and Varys had lived through that terrifying reign. He could not watch another Targaryen repeat history. Whether that meant forging an alliance behind Jon Snow or an entirely different candidate, he had to act, and soon. By dawn, the ocean's horizon shimmered in the thin sunlight, and Varys found himself summoned to Daenerys' presence. He walked through corridors echoing with the footsteps of unsullied guards, their discipline manifest in every perfectly aligned step. At the threshold to the great hall, he noted that Ser Grey Worm himself stood vigil on one side, Missandei's absence still a wound Daenerys wore like a brand upon her heart. As Varys was escorted in, he bowed low. On the high seat, Daenerys wore a severe expression. Her once silver hair was braided tightly against her scalp, accentuating the sharp angles of her cheekbones. Attention radiated from her. Anger pressed just beneath the surface. "You sent for me, Your Grace," Varys said softly. Her voice was measured but frigid. I have had a troubling report from one of my scouts. They claim that Lord Glover of Deepwood Motte is assembling men and fortifications. He offers little explanation, and I have reason to suspect he is no friend to me. Tell me what you know, Lord Varys. He was careful with his expression, keeping it neutral. Your Grace, the North was once fiercely loyal to the Starks. Many there still revere your loyal supporter, Jon Snow, or as some may say, Aegon Targaryen. That conflict of loyalties might cause confusion. She lifted her chin. Confusion? If they are confused, they can bend the knee more cleanly, rather than muster arms in secret. He could feel the temperature in the room shifting. He decided to be direct, though not fully. Your Grace, from the perspective of many lords, the revelation of Jon's Targaryen heritage troubles them. They have, until recently, regarded him as king in the north. Some remain wary of your claim, despite your dragons. She stood abruptly, stepping closer so the swirling cloak of gray and red parted around her legs. Then they are traitors. If they do not accept me, they place the realm in jeopardy. We need unity to rebuild after the wars we have fought. The White Walkers may be gone, but Cersei's influence still lingers in corners of the realm. I will not let these lords tear apart what I have fought to save. I understand, Your Grace, Varys said quietly, but perhaps consider a more measured approach. You have sacrificed much for Westeros, and the small folk know your generosity. My generosity? Her eyes hardened, the violet glint that reminded him so much of her lineage. I freed them from tyrants, only to find the lords themselves are not so easily freed from their illusions of autonomy. I do not desire slaughter, but I will not hesitate if they stand in my way. She pivoted away, her voice dropping. I must speak with Jon. This cannot continue. If he is fueling their rebellion. Varys saw the flicker of jealousy, a dangerous spark, crossing her face. He realized it was not just fear fueling Daenerys but pride. She had come so far, won so many victories, lost so many she held dear, and now she stood on the precipice of losing the one thing she believed was hers by birthright. That kind of cornered pride, combined with grief and paranoia, had turned kings into monsters before. It may be wise to invite him here to Dragonstone, Varys suggested. Perhaps a council with all your allies present. Show the realm you are united in purpose. She narrowed her eyes, as if testing his sincerity. Yes, a meeting, she murmured. We shall see if Jon stands with me or against me. With that, she waved him off. Varys bowed and left as swiftly as dignity allowed. Outside, he caught a glimpse of Tyrion's face in the corridor, half in shadow. The dwarf lingered, as if he had been about to enter the hall but hesitated upon hearing their conversation. He offered Varys a small nod, but beneath it lay deep concern. They exchanged no words. There was no need. Each was well aware something was festering within their queen. The raven flew swift across the skies, a sealed message attached to its leg. Varys made certain none saw him release it. The letter bore no official sigils, yet it was meant for the eyes of lords who had enough sense to consider an alternative to Daenerys. The gist was simple. Daenerys Targaryen was no longer stable, and the realm needed a new leader, Aegon Targaryen, known to all as Jon Snow. It reminded them that Jon had bent the knee under duress, with the army of the dead looming, and had only done so to save countless lives. His was not an ambition to rule, but a sense of duty. Beware the flames of a dragon turning cold, Varys had written, in the cryptic style he preferred. Should the realm's rightful heir step forward, will you be ready? He let the raven go in silence. No one noticed, for the castle was busy preparing for Daenerys' strategy council that evening, to which many lesser lords and captains had been invited. The hush was a result of her command. No one was to disturb her unless summoned. She had begun to keep mostly to herself, pacing the halls of Dragonstone, appearing at odd hours. The unsullied, loyal as ever, made no complaint, but the tension was undeniable. For the first time, Varys felt a coil of fear. Usually, he acted in shadows, weaving subtle webs. But this time, He was fueling open dissent that might become war if Daenerys discovered him too soon. Even so, he did not waver. Better this risk than the entire realm cast into flame. He turned from the battlements, glancing at the open sky. If Jon received these letters in time, if lords across the Seven Kingdoms chose to rally behind him, perhaps a swift, almost bloodless transition was possible. Perhaps Daenerys could be convinced to step aside, though he doubted that. More likely, it would mean open rebellion. His only hope was to rally as many lords as possible before confronting Daenerys directly. Jon Snow received the first of Varys' letters at Winterfell. He had returned to the north after the Battle of King's Landing, where Daenerys' show of force had led to Cersei's downfall but at a terrible cost. The city still smoldered in parts. Though Daenerys tried to quell the fires once she recognized how close she was to losing the city's love entirely. Even so, rumors of her cruelty had spread. She had not unleashed her full fury upon King's Landing, but enough innocents had died to make the realm uneasy. Jon could still see the haunted looks in people's eyes as they fled the capital after the battle. He had done his best to dissuade Daenerys from too much bloodshed, but she had been relentless. Some said she had intended to show mercy but was provoked. Others whispered that a Targaryen madness had begun to creep in. He wanted to believe she was still the brave woman he admired, the breaker of chains who had saved them all from the Night King. But the letter he now held in his hand threatened to shatter what little faith he had left. It was unsigned, but the words were carefully chosen. Jon recognized Varys' style. There was a reason he was called the Spider. Each line hinted at Daenerys' dangerous instability and urged Jon to step forward, claiming the Iron Throne as Aegon Targaryen, rightful king of the Undulls, the Rhoynar, and the First Men. Jon closed his eyes, exhaling in frustration. He stood in the courtyard of Winterfell. The sun was wan, the chill of the north ever present. Ghost padded near him, though only a step behind, as though sensing Jon's turmoil. Winterfell was still recovering from the wars, a skeleton crew of staff, repairs half-finished, storehouses not yet refilled. The idea of inciting another conflict filled Jon with dread. Yet the letter was not the only one he had received that week. Several northern lords had quietly approached him, explaining they had no love for Daenerys. They worried she might turn her dragons upon them if they so much as questioned her directives. Lord Glover, in particular, had mustered men to guard Deepwood Motte, all under the premise of protection against wildling raids, though there had been no raids in months. Jon knew better. Glover feared Daenerys' wrath. "What is it that troubles you, my lord?" Davos Seaworth asked, stepping up behind him. The old smuggler had a limp from an old injury, but he carried himself with quiet dignity. Jon handed him the letter without a word. Davos read it silently, brow furrowing. When he finished, he let out a long breath. "So Varys is stirring the pot. I'd guessed as much after seeing how Daenerys was these past weeks." Jon nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. "He wants me to press my claim. I never asked for that. I never wanted it." Davos handed the letter back. I know you didn't, but facts remain facts. You are Rhaegar's son. Some lords see you as the realm's only hope. Even if you don't want the crown, they might thrust it upon you all the same." Jon clenched his jaw. "If I do nothing, and Daenerys truly becomes as her father was, the realm will suffer. But to openly oppose her—" He paused, staring across the courtyard to the spot where Sansa once stood, complaining of the cold. He felt her absence keenly. She was in the Vale, conferring with Lord Royce about potential alliances. "I cannot forget what she did for us. She saved the North from the White Walkers. She lost so many, even her dragon, to defeat that threat. She is not evil." Davos put a hand on Jon's shoulder, a fatherly gesture. "She's not. But a wounded dragon is still a dragon, and maybe that wound festers. Perhaps the realm can't afford to wait and see." Jon swallowed hard. "I should go to her, speak to her. We may still reach an understanding without bloodshed." "Go carefully," Davos said. "Let the lords know your intentions. They might take it as a sign you're capitulating." Jon lowered his eyes. "Let them think what they want. I'll speak truth, and hopefully that will be enough. Tyrion Lannister found Varys in the map room at Dragonstone, the grand table with the carved topography of Westeros. Shadows flickered across the edges of the room, cast by tall braziers that spat flames into the dim air. Varys was studying markers on the map, wooden lions and dragons that indicated troop positions. He did not look up as Tyrion approached, though Tyrion noted the tension in the air. "Are you going to tell me what exactly you're doing?" Tyrion asked, voice low. His time as Hand of the Queen had been fraught of late. Daenerys' trust in him wavered every time conflict arose in the realm. "Daenerys is restless. She's even more suspicious than usual. And I suspect your hand in that." Varys sighed and straightened, glancing at Tyrion with weary eyes. "I'm doing what I must for the realm, Tyrion, as I always do." Tyrion stepped closer, resting his hands on the edge of the table. "Let me guess. You're quietly encouraging the lords to back Jon. You see Daenerys slipping away into madness, and you'd rather see Jon on the throne. That it? You know me too well." Varys' tone was a whisper, as if even the walls had ears. "You've seen the same signs, her temper, her paranoia, the ease with which she considers punishing dissent by fire. And consider her lineage." Tyrion cut him off, voice thick with frustration. "I know, yes, her father was mad, but that doesn't mean she must be. We've both seen her compassion, her willingness to fight for the helpless." Varys inclined his head. "Compassion can sour into vengeance when the object of your compassion doesn't reciprocate loyalty. She sees betrayal everywhere. I fear it won't be long before she decides the best way to rule is through fear. She has dragons, Tyrion. Dragons that can level cities." A moment of silence stretched between them as the flames in the braziers crackled. Tyrion drummed his fingers on the table. "I will not stand by if you plan to have her assassinated." Varys frowned. "I have no desire for such a path. Even if it were feasible, it would plunge the realm into chaos, possibly a war of succession. We must proceed carefully, bring Jon forward, let him press his rightful claim. The lords will back him, the people revere him as a hero. Daenerys, in turn, might see the overwhelming strength aligned against her and concede." "You think she'll just concede?" Tyrion repeated, a note of incredulity in his voice. "She who has come all this way, suffered so much, lost so much? She believes she's the last hope of her house. Targaryens don't just yield." Varys stared at him, his expression haunted. "I fear if she does not yield, then war is inevitable." Tyrion pressed his lips together, the lines of worry deepening in his forehead. He remembered when he first believed in Daenerys, her gentle heart, her revolutionary spirit that broke chains and liberated slaves. But time and loss had changed her. That was not unusual for rulers or for anyone who fought war after war, who buried loved ones on foreign shores. "I can't help but think there might be another way. If only she and Jon could come to an understanding, share the throne, or something." Varys' gaze flickered across the map, as though searching for solutions in the carved mountains and rivers. "We can hope, but if that fails, Tyrion..." Tyrion frowned. "Yes, I know. You'll do what must be done." Varys nodded, the slightest gesture, as if his head were weighed down with guilt. "I only ask you remember that I act for the good of the realm. If Daenerys were stable, none of this would be necessary." Tyrion stepped away from the table, his eyes on the flickering torchlight that danced along the walls. "I know, Varys, but the question remains. When the time comes to choose, what side will I stand on?" "I gave her my word." Varys said nothing. Tyrion left the room, the echoes of his footsteps trailing through the corridor like a heavy question. Daenerys convened her war council that evening in the throne room of Dragonstone. The seat carved from dragonbone rose behind her, a forbidding shadow in the candlelight. Jon had arrived earlier that day, escorted by a small contingent of northern soldiers. They were not quite guests, not quite prisoners. The tension between them was palpable. She had invited various lords from the Crownlands, a few from the Reach who had chosen to remain loyal, and representatives from Dorne who were still forging a fragile alliance. Standing to one side, arms folded, Grey Worm wore an impenetrable mask. To the other side, Tyrion hovered, glancing nervously between Daenerys and Jon. Varys stood behind Tyrion, quietly watching. Ser Brienne of Tarth was also there, representing Sansa's interests in the north, though Sansa herself had not come. Jon stood at the center of the room, wearing furs against the chill, his jaw set with quiet determination. Daenerys looked upon him with a mixture of longing and betrayal, as though both love and resentment warred within her chest. The flickering firelight accented the silver of her hair and the pallor of her face. Daenerys lifted a hand, commanding silence. "We are here to address reports of unrest in the north, and perhaps beyond. I have heard rumors that certain lords are fortifying their holds, refusing to pay taxes, ignoring my summons. I will not allow that to stand. I ask Jon Snow, Aegon Targaryen, what say you in this matter? You who have the love of the north." Jon inclined his head, carefully measuring his words. "The north bled in the wars against the Night King, then against Cersei. They have seen your dragons burn countless foes, and they fear that should they displease you, they'll be the next to burn. They are wary, your grace." She narrowed her eyes. "Wary? After I risked everything to save them from the undead? How can they be so quick to judge me?" Jon shook his head, lips pressing into a grim line. "You must understand, Northmen do not trust easily. They are loyal once their trust is earned, but they have been scarred by too many broken promises. Word travels fast. People speak of the devastation at King's Landing, of your fury. They whisper that your father burned his enemies, that you might do the same. I know you're not your father, but fear is seldom rational." Her eyes widened slightly. "And what do you think, Jon? Do you fear me?" Jon's gaze flicked toward her dragons, perched somewhere on the castle's ramparts. "I believe you've done great things, but I also believe a queen must rule not through fear alone." She exhaled, her temper held in check by a thin thread. "I do not desire fear, but if that is the only means to secure peace, to ensure the realm does not tear itself apart, then I will not hesitate." At that, Lord Royce of the Vale, standing near Brienne, cleared his throat. "Your Grace, we all want peace, but the Vale also has concerns." Daenerys's gaze snapped to him. "Concerns? Yes, I've heard them. Are you implying you, too, doubt my right to the throne? That you, too, would see Jon Snow supplant me?" Royce stepped back, alarmed by her tone. "I mean no challenge, my queen. We only want reassurance you will not use your dragons on us if any disagreement arises." Across the hall, Varys could see the tension coiling. Daenerys's anger was flaring, and he wondered if the letter he'd sent to Royce had borne fruit. Perhaps the mention of Jon's rightful claim had emboldened the man. Daenerys drew herself up, her presence regal and terrifying at once. "Lord Royce, if your loyalty to me is true, then you have nothing to fear. I have no interest in burning loyal subjects." She paused, her voice dropping dangerously. "But if you entertain thoughts of treason, if you would place another upon my throne, then consider me your enemy. And yes, I will use every weapon at my disposal to protect my birthright." A hush descended over the room. Tyrion shot a nervous glance at Varys, as if to say, "You see, this is what I feared." Jon took a step forward. "Your Grace, I urge caution. You fought for the people's love, not just their submission. If you threaten them..." Daenerys rounded on him. "Do you question my right, Jon Snow? Aegon Targaryen? If you harbor the ambition to rule, speak it plainly. Otherwise, proclaim your loyalty to me here, before all these lords." For a long moment, Jon was silent. He could feel every eye upon him. He saw men who were loyal to him, who believed in him, waiting for him to either bend or stand. He remembered the countless nights after the war with the White Walkers when Daenerys had saved them all with her dragons. He remembered, too, the charred corpses in King's Landing, the vacant stares of children who had lost everything. Finally, he drew a breath. "I have never sought the throne. I bent the knee once because I believed it was the only way to save our people. I stand by the choice to unite against the threats we face. But I will not stand idle if the queen I pledged to becomes a tyrant. Gasps and whispers shot through the assembled lords. Daenerys's face went white with fury. The tension coalesced, and for a moment, it seemed she might order Jon seized or worse. Tyrion's hand fluttered at his side, as if ready to intervene. Grey Worm took a step forward, hand on his spear. Then Daenerys laughed, a short, mirthless sound. "Tyrant? Is that how you speak of me, after everything?" Her voice trembled, grief and rage mingling. "I see it now. You, who discovered you had Targaryen blood, have coveted my throne all along. Perhaps you never truly loved me, only used me." Jon's face twisted with pain. "You know that's not true. I never wanted any of this. I only want the realm at peace." She shook her head, stepping away. "Very well, Jon Snow. Perhaps your presence in the north is necessary, so you can see to the repairs and calm the lords. But hear this, if I sense you are moving against me, if I learn you encourage these lords to defy me, I will respond as a queen must. And I promise you, it will be as harsh as the realm has ever seen." No one dared speak. Tyrion swallowed, scanning the faces of the lords, many of whom looked horrified. Brienne's hand moved subconsciously toward her sword. Varys maintained a stillness that belied his pounding heart. This was the moment the realm's fate wobbled on a knife's edge. "Go," Daenerys commanded. "All of you, we will speak again soon. For now, this meeting is over." Jon bowed stiffly and left the throne room, the crowd parting before him like waves. As Daenerys stood alone near her seat, the flicker in her eyes betrayed both a desperate sorrow and a growing wrath. Tyrion and Varys exchanged a wordless look before following the others out. That same night, Varys paced in his small chamber, listening to the wind rattle the shutters. He knew this confrontation might come. He hadn't anticipated it to escalate so quickly. Daenerys's words rang in his mind. "I promise you, it will be as harsh as the realm has ever seen." If she unleashed her fury, it might overshadow even what she had done at King's Landing. She had only partially burned that city in her final confrontation with Cersei. But if she felt cornered or betrayed, he heard footsteps in the corridor, and for a moment he feared discovery. But the knock at his door was soft, hesitant. He opened it to find Tyrion, cloak drawn tight, face pale with concern. "May I come in?" Tyrion asked in a hushed voice. Varys ushered him inside. "Of course." Tyrion stepped close, as if frightened someone might overhear. The roar of the sea battered the walls of the castle. "She's asked Grey Worm to stand guard at her door. She doesn't trust anyone. Not even me." Varys's expression tightened. "That means she suspects many. I fear I do not have much time if she learns I've been sending letters." Tyrion sank into a chair. "You're certain you want to continue this course? Jon tried to reason with her tonight. Perhaps we should wait, see if she'll calm down." Varys shook his head, sorrow in his voice. "You saw her, Tyrion. She's gone beyond reason for now. If she felt threatened enough to lash out at Jon in front of half the lords, can you imagine how she'll act if they truly rebel?" Tyrion was quiet, shoulders slumped in resignation. "I told you before, I won't stand by and watch her be murdered." Varys nodded, stepping to his hidden compartment beneath the flagstone. He lifted it. Inside were letters sealed, ready for dispatch. "I do not intend to murder her. I intend to rouse the realm behind Jon, in the hope that a show of overwhelming force might compel her to step down, at least surrender the idea that she rules alone." He paused. "If she chooses to fight, then it will be war." Tyrion swore under his breath. "And the realm bleeds again. Do we never stop fighting?" "Not while we have rulers who put themselves above the realm," Varys said, with no small measure of bitterness. "If it's not Daenerys, it's someone else. Someone hungry for power." A hush fell between them, interrupted only by the gentle crackling of a lantern. At length Tyrion spoke again. "I won't hinder you, but I cannot sign my name to your efforts, at least not yet. I wish to see if there's still a path through all this without bloodshed. If you're discovered, I'll deny involvement." Varys offered a sad smile. "I expect nothing less. You'll do what you must." Tyrion gave a nod and stood. "Just be careful, old friend. She still has 2 dragons." Varys watched him go, then turned to the letters. His resolve hardened. He would send them all out, urging the lords to gather under Jon Snow. The realm would not be safe otherwise. He was certain of that now. Across the narrow sea of moorland that surrounded Dragonstone, word spread quickly among small folk that the queen and her advisors quarreled. Runners and ravens carried rumors to the mainland. The north was restless, King's Landing still smoldered, and Daenerys Targaryen was on the verge of a rage that might ignite the entire realm. Lords who had once hoped to remain neutral started whispering of alliances, particularly with Jon Snow, whose consistent honesty and legendary valor appealed to them more than Daenerys's fearsome might. At Deepwood Motte, Lord Glover paced along his battlements, reading the latest missive from Varys. It laid out in stark terms the threat Daenerys posed if her rule went unchecked, and the rightful heritage of Jon Snow. Glover thought of the destruction he had heard rumored from the south, of the intangible sense of dread that Daenerys's name now conjured in conversation. He had not wanted another war, but the letter was compelling, and Varys implied that many other lords were rallying to Jon. If Glover joined now, maybe the combined force would be large enough to bring Daenerys to heel without a pitched battle. So, with a grim determination, Glover ordered his men to prepare for possible conflict. The banners of the Wolfshed and the motto of the Glovers fluttered in the chill wind, the men beneath them anxious yet resolved. Word would be sent to Jon that Deepwood Motte stood ready to follow him, if he claimed the throne. Jon had barely slept in the cramped chambers assigned to him at Dragonstone. The next morning, he requested a private audience with Daenerys, hoping to speak without the heated presence of lords and counselors. To his relief, she agreed. They met in a smaller antechamber off the main throne room, where the windows overlooked the sea. Grey Worm stood at the door, watchful. Daenerys was still in her formal attire, tight-fitting black and crimson robes, the Targaryen 3-headed dragon pinned at her shoulder. She gazed out the window as Jon entered, her back rigid. When he cleared his throat, she turned. Her face was drawn, weary circles beneath her eyes. He spoke first. "Thank you for seeing me alone." She nodded curtly. "I supposed I owed you that much. Say what you will." Jon inhaled. "I want no quarrel with you, but you must see how your threats unsettle the realm. They fear another mad Targaryen. They see glimpses of fire and blood when they look at you. Please, Dany, if we can show them you are still the queen who freed the slaves, who fought the White Walkers, maybe their fears will ease." "Will they?" Her tone was cool. "My enemies spin tales of my father's madness, hoping to paint me with the same brush. My own advisors, it seems, doubt my fitness to rule." Tyrion stands there, wringing his hands. Varys lurks in corners, whispering behind my back. "And you stand here, telling me to be gentle with men who speak openly of rebellion." "They wouldn't rebel if they felt safe," Jon said gently. "You can make them feel safe by hearing their concerns, by promising fair judgment, not destruction. Perhaps if we traveled together, let them see we stand united." "United?" She laughed, the sound brittle. "And whose name do they cheer when we arrive?" "Yours, I suspect. You, the White Wolf, the bastard of Winterfell who isn't a bastard at all. The prince that was promised, the rightful heir by their reckoning." Jon shook his head. "I never wanted any of it. I'd renounce it officially if I could, but people won't forget so easily." She studied his face, searching for deceit. Finding none, she whispered, "Do you still love me?" He paused, eyes flickering with pain. "I do, but love alone cannot heal all wounds. We've both changed too much, I fear." Her breath caught. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Then stand by me. Rule with me. I offered before that we might marry, our bond uniting the Targaryen name. You refused out of some notion of wrongness, some northern taboo. But the realm once married aunt to nephew if it meant keeping bloodlines pure and forging alliances. Our house has done it before." Jon's heart pounded. He remembered that moment in the north, when they first learned the truth, how it had driven a wedge between them. "You know I cannot take you as my wife. I cannot be both your lover and your nephew. We come from different worlds." "Different worlds," she echoed, bitterness lacing her tone. "If that is how you see it, then so be it." She hardened her stance. "I am queen. Whether I have your support or not, I will rule. If you choose to oppose me, know that I will meet your opposition with fire." Jon's shoulders sagged. "I would never raise arms against you unless you left me no choice. But for the sake of the realm." "I tire of hearing about the realm," she hissed, voice cracking. "The realm is full of ungrateful, foolish lords who would rather follow a northerner with a name they can trust than the mother of dragons. And you want to coddle them." She exhaled shakily, turning away. "I see now. The time for compromise may be over." He wanted to reach for her hand, to find some vestige of the woman who had once ignited his hope. But she was distant, locked in sorrow and anger. Carefully he bowed. "Then I will leave Dragonstone, if that is your wish to see to my people." She did not look at him. "Go, Jon Snow. I will not stop you. But heed this final warning. If you cross me, if you dare to challenge my claim, I will burn your armies, your castles, and all who stand behind you. Do not test me." He left without another word. Varys watched from a window high in the castle as Jon rode out, flanked by a handful of northern soldiers. The day was gray, clouds shifting ominously overhead. The sea churned with restless waves. Jon's departure did not feel like a sign of peace. It felt like the first wedge hammered into the realm, dividing loyalties. The spider closed his eyes, feeling the weight of what came next. It was time to act decisively. He dispatched more ravens, carrying letters with the same dire warning. The queen was unwell, consumed by a mounting paranoia, and only Jon Snow could unify the land. The letters spread across the 7 kingdoms, to lords in the Westerlands who had grown tired of war, to Storm's End where Gendry Baratheon was newly legitimized, to the Iron Islands where Yara Greyjoy had once pledged to Daenerys but might waver if she believed the queen was on a path to madness. He took pains to ensure no single raven was burdened with too many letters. If one were intercepted, the rest might still get through. He also made certain his personal guards had coin enough to bribe any prying eyes. But he knew well that nothing was certain once letters took flight. Still, he pressed on because time was short. If Daenerys discovered his involvement too soon, she might have him executed before his plans took root. The lords of Westeros received the letters in their halls. Some in the hush of night, some in broad daylight. Reactions varied. Some dismissed the spider's warnings as alarmist or manipulative. Others weighed them carefully, knowing Varys's reputation for being better informed than anyone else. Lord Glover's muster grew. The Mandalese considered sending ships to White Harbor. The Vale prepared for the possibility of war. Even the Tullis of Riverrun had begun to reassert themselves and wondered if it was time to rally behind Jon, a nephew to their house by way of Ned Stark's children. In the Westerlands, certain minor lords who had once followed the Lannisters blindly now faced a different reality. The Lannister name was diminished, with Cersei gone and Tyrion pledged to Daenerys, yet Tyrion's own loyalty seemed uncertain. Some recognized that the Targaryens' hold on the throne was precarious. Many had endured enough war to fill a lifetime, but they also feared a queen who might treat them as enemies if they hesitated. Whispers traveled like wildfire through taverns and market squares. Jon Snow, the bastard of Winterfell, was actually Aegon Targaryen, son of Rhaegar. He had united the living against the dead. He had a claim stronger than Daenerys's by some accounts. He might be their best hope or their next conqueror. Few agreed on the truth, but nearly everyone agreed that the realm was barreling toward another conflict. Days after his departure from Dragonstone, Jon Snow arrived in Winterfell. The courtyard was still battered from the wars. The ramparts were manned by tired, grizzled soldiers. As he dismounted, Davos greeted him, relief plain on the old knight's face. "How did it go, lad?" Davos asked quietly, though the question hardly needed posing. Jon's grim countenance told him everything. Jon handed his reins to a stable boy. "She's not the same. She distrusts everyone now. She threatened me. Davos cursed softly. And we have letters from all over the realm. Men are starting to declare for you outright. Some haven't pledged yet, but they're leaning. They're waiting to see if you'll stand against her or if you'll kneel. Jon felt a pang of sorrow. I won't kneel for a tyrant, but if that's the path she chooses. He trailed off, remembering her eyes, the heartbreak in her voice. The realm can't survive another war, Davos. Too many are dead already. Davos nodded. Yet better a short, decisive war than decades of terror under a mad ruler. Jon exhaled. Gather the lords who have pledged. I'll meet them. Perhaps we can show Daenerys that half the realm stands with me. Maybe that will make her relent. Davos dipped his head. I'll see to it. Jon climbed the steps to the great hall, memories swarming him. He imagined Ned Stark seated in the Lord's chair, dispensing justice. He imagined Robb Stark crowned king in the north. Now he was Aegon Targaryen, though his heart was still in Winterfell. He found no joy in his heritage, only a burden he had never asked for. If war came, it would pit him against the woman he once loved, the woman who saved them all from the Night King. Yet if she brought fire and blood upon the realm, he had no choice but to stand in her path. At Dragonstone, Daenerys's mood continued to darken. She stood on the beach, waves lapping at her boots, as Drogon circled overhead. Rhaegal was gone, killed in battle. Only Drogon remained as the living symbol of her power. She missed her dragons from days past. She missed the feeling of invincibility they gave her, before the wars had chipped away at her confidence. Grey Worm approached, chest plate gleaming in the murky daylight. Your Grace, you asked for a report? She turned, the salt air whipping strands of silver hair across her face. Yes, tell me of the movements in the realm. He hesitated. It appears the north is calling banners. The Vale, too, is mustering forces. Many are citing a desire to defend themselves should you retaliate. She scowled. And I will retaliate if they openly defy me. Are they swearing themselves to Jon Snow? Grey Worm's expression was carefully schooled. Many lords are claiming he is the rightful heir. Others merely say they fear your wrath. She made a low sound in her throat, like the growl of a cornered animal. I offered them mercy. I offered them unity, but they spit on my generosity. She gazed up at Drogon, who landed on a rocky outcrop, roaring. I will not let them tear my birthright away. Grey Worm bowed his head. What would you have me do? She turned back to him. Send word to the loyal houses. We march for the mainland soon. If I must confront these traitors in the field, so be it. He nodded but did not leave immediately. She glanced at him, annoyance flickering in her eyes. Is there something else? He cleared his throat. The men are uneasy. They do not wish another war, especially against those who once fought alongside us against the Night King. The Dothraki are eager for battle, but the Unsullied are concerned. She nodded slowly. We do what we must, Grey Worm. Our enemies have chosen this path. I only hope once they see our strength, they will yield without much bloodshed. Her words were hollow, even to her own ears. She knew the realm had changed. If she wanted to remain queen, it might require an unforgiving demonstration of power. Inside her chest, she felt a pang that threatened to crack her calm facade. But she had come too far. She would not back down. As Grey Worm departed, Daenerys stood on the shore a while longer, Drogon's presence a silent reminder of her heritage. She thought of Jon. A part of her wanted him by her side, ruling together, uniting Targaryen blood to keep the realm strong. Another part of her recognized that perhaps it was too late for that. She tasted bitterness on her tongue, salty as the sea. When she finally turned to walk back to the castle, she spotted a figure waiting near the entry to the courtyard. A small silhouette, robed in black. Varys, that cunning spider who always seemed to materialize where secrets thrived. She wondered how long he had been watching her, and she wondered how many words he had spun behind her back. For the moment, she ignored him and moved on. His time, she suspected, was running short. So was hers, if she did not act swiftly. Varys gathered up one final letter, feeling dread coil in his stomach. He had heard whispers that Daenerys was preparing to strike. Once she set sail for the mainland, everything would hinge on who mustered faster, and who stood where. If too few lords backed Jon, she might crush him in a single campaign. If enough declared for Jon, it might be Daenerys who found herself outnumbered. He sealed the letter and handed it to a trusted messenger, one of the few he had personally employed since arriving. The messenger bowed, tucking the parchment into his satchel. Varys gave him a small purse of coins for good measure. "Take care," Varys said. "There are eyes everywhere. This must reach Storm's End without interception." The messenger nodded. "Yes, my lord. I'll be careful." Once the man departed, Varys sank into a chair, feeling exhausted. His mind whirled with possibilities. Perhaps, if the tides of alliances grew large enough, Daenerys would see reason. Perhaps she would see that the realm would rise up against her, and she would relinquish her seat in favor of Jon. But he had lived too long, seen too many tyrants. He suspected she would take flight upon Drogon and let the flames decide. He did not hear the footsteps until they were close. A door opened behind him. Tyrion entered, face ashen, followed by two unsullied guards. Varys stood swiftly, alarmed by Tyrion's expression. "Varys," Tyrion murmured, voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry." Before Varys could speak, the Unsullied seized him by the arms. Varys's heart clenched. Had Daenerys discovered his letters so soon? Tyrion's eyes brimmed with regret. "They found one of the messengers. He was carrying your letter, naming Jon Snow as the rightful heir, urging Storm's End to rebel. She knows everything." Varys felt his stomach twist, though he steadied his voice. "Then I suppose this is the end. So be it." The guards dragged him forward, but he did not resist. Tyrion shuffled along, wearing a look that mingled pity with fear. They led Varys out into the courtyard, where night had fallen. Torches cast lurid shadows across the ground. Daenerys stood, Drogon looming behind her, tail thrashing against the stone. Her face was etched with a cold fury, lit by the flickering flames. She pointed at Varys. "You betrayed me." Varys bowed his head, though his voice was steady. "I acted in the interest of the realm. I fear you have lost your way, your grace." She flinched, but the rage in her eyes did not wane. "Your words are poison. You have turned lords against me, fed them lies." "No lies," Varys replied softly. "You have threatened to burn them, to rule through fear. They see it. I see it." Tyrion took a step forward, as if to speak in Varys's defense, but Daenerys silenced him with a glare. Grey Worm stood beside her, spear in hand. Several of her remaining Dothraki lingered at the edges, eyes shining with cruel anticipation. She raised her voice. "Treason is punishable by death. Any last words, Lord Varys?" He looked at Tyrion, giving him a sad smile. Then he turned his gaze to Daenerys. "I hope I am wrong about you. I hope you truly can break the wheel, bring peace. But you must know that if you choose fire and blood, the realm will not bend willingly. They will rise against you, and no dragon can burn an entire continent without turning it to ashes." He paused, letting out a slow breath. "I'm sorry for all that's been lost. I truly am." Daenerys's lips pressed together, her eyes shining with unshed tears of wrath or regret. Varys could not tell. She inclined her head to Grey Worm, who lifted a torch. Drogon growled, a deep rumble that shook the courtyard. The soldiers forced Varys onto his knees. He did not scream or protest. He simply closed his eyes and murmured, "I serve the realm. May it find peace." Then Drogon's roar split the night, and the wave of fire consumed him in an instant. The gathered watchers stood in horror or awe, the conflagration lighting their faces as the Master of Whispers was reduced to ash. Tyrion turned away, tears sliding down his cheeks. When the flames subsided, Daenerys stood trembling. The smell of charred flesh hung in the air, and wisps of smoke curled around them. She lifted her chin, though her eyes were haunted. Anyone else who conspires against me will share his fate." Without another word, she turned and walked away, Grey Worm trailing in her wake. Drogon leapt into the air, beating his colossal wings, as if proclaiming to the night sky the Queen's final judgment upon traitors. Word spread of Varys's execution, carried on the tongues of fleeing servants and terrified soldiers. By the time news reached Winterfell, it ignited the Lord's fears and cemented their resolve. The Spider had been widely regarded as a man who worked behind the scenes for stability. If Daenerys had burned him alive, it confirmed the worst of their suspicions. The effect was immediate and galvanizing. No one wished to fall victim to Dragonfire. Lord Glover, the Vale, the Riverlands, they began openly preparing for war. Jon Snow stood with Davos, Tormund, and Ser Brienne in the Great Hall. An array of northern lords gathered, each wearing grim expressions. They had assembled banners from across the region, more than Jon had anticipated. Lord Glover cleared his throat. "My lord, your grace, I speak for many of us when I say Daenerys has shown she will burn any who oppose her. She's no better than the Mad King. We must act before she brings her army north." Jon looked over the crowd, the faces of proud men and women who had survived the long night, who had fought valiantly to protect their families. They were weary of war, yet resolute now that their survival was threatened once more. Brienne of Tarth stepped forward. "Sansa sends her regrets that she cannot be here. She remains in the Vale, rallying support. She bids you do what must be done. The Vale stands behind you." Tormund Giantsbane grunted. "You saved us all once, Jon Snow, and we won't stand by while some dragon queen burns our homes." Jon's heart felt like it was being squeezed. He stood at the dais, wearing a mantle of dark fur. Ghost lay curled at his feet. For a moment, he could almost hear Ned Stark's voice telling him to act honorably. He spoke, voice steady. "I did not want a crown. I bent the knee to Daenerys because I believed in her and in peace. But she has chosen a path of fear and destruction. I will not abandon my people to that fate." He paused, scanning the crowd. "I will call the banners. If Daenerys seeks to march on the north, we will defend ourselves. We will ask her to stand down, but if she refuses, then we do what we must." A few lords cheered quietly. Most simply bowed, a resolute acceptance of war. Davos met Jon's gaze. "We can try sending terms. Though I doubt she'll listen, at least we can say we tried." Jon inclined his head. "Yes, send a messenger. Offer to meet without weapons. A parley to see if we can come to a resolution." He almost choked on the next words. "But prepare the troops. If she refuses, we will fight." A raven arrived at Dragonstone bearing Jon's message. Daenerys read it while Tyrion stood by her, wringing his hands. She had scarcely eaten for days, her cheeks drawn, eyes cold. The message was simple, an appeal to meet on neutral ground to avoid further bloodshed. But beneath the politeness lay a clear ultimatum. Step aside, or face the combined armies of the North, Vale, and Riverlands. She set the letter aside, her jaw taut. "He dares to command me? I am the Queen." Tyrion nodded, a tremor in his voice. "He does not command you. He asks for a meeting for the sake of the realm. If we can find a compromise." "Compromise?" she spat. "Has he not conspired behind my back with that traitor Varys? And now Varys is dead, and Jon rallies the lords. No, Tyrion, there is only one outcome here. I will quash this rebellion before it grows." Tyrion swallowed. "And the letter, my queen? Do we respond?" Daenerys rose, her cloak sweeping the floor. She moved to the window where she could see Drogon perched on a distant tower. "Yes, respond. Tell him I will not bend. If he wishes to remain free of my wrath, he will disband his armies. If he refuses, I will come for him on Dragonback." Tyrion tried once more. "If you meet him, perhaps you can persuade him." She spun, eyes blazing. "Did you not see what persuasion has gained me so far? Betrayal at every turn. Enough." She turned away, voice low. "Prepare the fleet. We sail for King's Landing first. I will reestablish order there, root out any who plan treason. then march north. If the north stands against me, I will make them regret it." Tyrion nodded reluctantly, knowing his protests were futile. As he left, he felt a hollowness in his stomach. Varys was dead, and Jon had all but declared war. The realm balanced on a precipice. Daenerys Targaryen intended to secure her throne with fire and blood. Jon Snow, forced by duty and the pleas of countless lords, would stand against her. The final tragedy was set in motion, and none could see how it might end without rivers of blood. And so it was that fleets prepared to depart Dragonstone, unsullied and Dothraki mustered, and a queen's anger darkened the skies like gathering storm clouds. Ravens flew from Dragonstone to every corner of the realm, carrying Daenerys's ultimatum. Those who defied her would face the full might of her dragons. Those who submitted would be spared. Few believed her promise of mercy anymore, not after King's Landing and Varys. In Winterfell, Jon Snow watched as lords arrived daily, swelling his forces. They came with banners of the old houses: Glover, Manderley, Royce, Tully, Serwyn, Reed. Even some men from the Westerlands drifted north, having lost faith in the Targaryen queen. When the time came, they would march south to face her. Yet their hearts were heavy, for they marched not against a foreign conqueror, but the very woman who had once helped save them all. The nights grew longer. Bonfires lit the courtyard as men sharpened swords and fletched arrows. Ser Brienne drilled a new generation of soldiers in the yard, emphasizing discipline and unity. Tormund oversaw the free folk volunteers, who fought differently but with savage skill. Davos and the other counselors worked on logistics, food, supplies, alliances. Jon, for his part, scarcely found rest. He trained with his men by day, but at night he pored over maps, weighed strategies with the other commanders. He wanted to avoid direct confrontation with Drogon if he could. No number of archers would easily bring down a full-grown dragon. Perhaps if they surprised Daenerys' forces, or if they cornered her away from Drogon, but all such plans seemed bleak and dangerous. He often found himself glancing at the seat in the great hall where the Starks sat. Ned Stark's voice echoed in his mind. The man who passes the sentence should swing the sword. Jon had never shrunk from duty, but the thought of crossing blades with Daenerys filled him with dread. Even if she were a tyrant in the making, she was not a faceless foe. She was someone he had cared for deeply. Yet the realm demanded a champion, and all the lords looked to him. "You're quiet," Davos observed one evening as they examined the map by torchlight. "Not that I blame you." Jon rubbed his brow. "I can't see a victory here that doesn't cost thousands of lives. Unless by some miracle she listens." Davos nodded sadly. "Miracles are in short supply these days." Jon straightened, jaw tightening. "I will try one last time to speak with her. Perhaps if we meet on the battlefield, I can force a parley. She might listen to reason, some memory of who she was before." Davos sighed. "A risky gamble, lad. But if it spares bloodshed, maybe it's worth the chance." Outside, the winter wind howled like a restless ghost. Daenerys' fleet reached King's Landing within a fortnight. The city still bore scars from the last battle, but it had recovered somewhat under her forced rule. The local lords, once allied with Cersei, had either fled or bent the knee. Now, soldiers patrolled the walls more heavily, aware that war with the North might be coming. Rumors of Daenerys' wrath had spread. Some followed her out of fear, others out of hope that she could maintain order. She stationed the majority of her forces just outside the city. From the Red Keep, she could see the camps of Unsullied, Dothraki, and various southern houses still loyal to her cause. The golden banners of House Tyrell had once flown here, but with the Tyrells gone, the Reach's loyalties were uncertain at best. She knew time was of the essence. If the Northmen marched, she needed to meet them with overwhelming force. Tyrion approached her in the throne room, still partially rebuilt since the destruction. The Iron Throne stood as a melted ruin in this timeline, or mostly intact. In the aftermath of the war, the throne had been damaged, but it was repaired enough to serve as a seat. Daenerys' banner hung behind it. "My queen," he said, bowing. The reports indicate that Jon's forces have swelled. He has men from the Vale, the Riverlands, possibly more from the Reach. If we're going to move north, we should do so soon, or risk them gaining further support. She regarded him with narrowed eyes. Yes, we march soon. But first, I want to root out any lingering loyalties to Jon here in King's Landing. Make sure no one is planning to overthrow me while I'm gone. See to it. Tyrion stiffened, but nodded. I will. But, Your Grace, what if we sent one final offer of peace? If we treat with Jon? Her glare stopped him. Jon is a traitor. He defies my rightful claim. If he lays down his arms, I might consider sparing him. Otherwise, his fate will be that of all traitors. Tyrion bowed, saying nothing. Once, he might have argued fervently. But after Varys, he knew her patience for dissent was spent. Left alone, Daenerys ascended the throne and stared at the empty hall before her, haunted by echoes of ghosts. She imagined the day her father sat the throne, raving about burning them all. She closed her eyes, telling herself she was not him, that she fought for a better world. But the lines had blurred. In her darkest moments, she wondered if the price for peace was to become the dragon everyone feared. The realm had left her no other choice, she told herself. They refused to love her, so they would learn to fear her. She would break the wheel, even if she had to do it with blood and fire. Battalions marched under banners of the wolf, the falcon, the trout, the flayed man, what remained of House Bolton's forces having shifted allegiances under new leadership, and more. They converged near the neck, forming the largest host Westeros had seen since the War of the Five Kings. Jon Snow rode among them, accompanied by Tormund, Davos, and other stalwarts. A hush lay upon them, for though they were many, they knew the queen had a dragon. They'd all heard the tales of how Drogon had decimated armies in Essos. This was no ordinary foe, but their resolve was unbreakable. They had bled for the North, for their loved ones. If the alternative was surrendering their autonomy to a queen who had shown she might burn them at the slightest offense, they would fight no matter the odds. Scouts reported that Daenerys' army was on the move from King's Landing, heading northward along the King's Road. They marched in disciplined columns. Unsullied in the vanguard, Dothraki outriders, and loyal houses trailing behind. Drogon was spotted overhead occasionally, a black silhouette against the sky. Jon established a forward camp near Moat Cailin, an ancient fortress that guarded the entrance to the north. He set about reinforcing the battlements and the causeway. Should Daenerys try to force her way through the swampy terrain, she might be slowed enough for their archers and ballistae to strike Drogon. They had prepared scorpions, large crossbows designed to pierce dragonhide, though none knew if they would be enough. As the day of reckoning approached, Jon convened a war council. Gathered around the rough-hewn table were the lords of the North and the Vale. Brienne and several knights from the Riverlands stood to one side, discussing strategy. Davos unrolled a map, candlelight illuminating the line of the King's Road. "She'll have to pass Moat Cailin," Davos said, pointing. "If we hold the fortress, we can force her into open ground. Our best chance to deal with Drogon might be in the open, where we have clear lines of fire with the scorpions." Lord Royce, helm in hand, nodded. "The Vale Knights can flank from the hills. If the Dothraki charge, we can meet them with a cavalry of our own." Jon folded his arms, eyes distant. "Remember, if there's any chance to parley, we take it. If we can avoid a full battle—" "Your Grace," Lord Glover interjected, "I fear she will not parley. She executed Varys without trial. She burned King's Landing once before." Jon grimaced. "Then we prepare for the worst." The men dispersed to see to their troops. Jon stared at the map a moment longer, weighed by the sorrow of it all. He thought of Daenerys, how her laughter once warmed him during the darkest times. Now, they stood on opposite sides of a conflict that could tear the realm apart. All because of birthright and fear. Davos placed a hand on his shoulder. "There's still hope," he said softly. "She might see the size of your host, decide not to throw everything away." Jon managed a small nod. "We'll see soon enough." Daenerys' host approached Moat Cailin days later. Scouts carried reports back and forth. The fortress was bristling with northern men, scorpions lining the walls. The causeway through the swamps was treacherous. Any direct assault would be costly. The queen held her council in a large command tent. Grey Worm stood to her right, unsullied stoicism giving her strength. Tyrion stood to her left, face bleak, fiddling with his cloak. If we attack Moat Cailin directly, we risk heavy casualties, Tyrion ventured. Perhaps there is a way around, through the swamps. The swamps are a maze, Grey Worm said. We would lose men to quicksand and hidden archers. Daenerys gazed at a map splayed on the table, the weight of her armies behind her. Then we lure them out. I will fly Drogon above the fortress. Once the men on the walls see the dragon, it will sow terror. Perhaps they will break ranks. Tyrion stepped forward, voice tight with worry. Your Grace, if you fly too close, their scorpions might wound Drogon. If they fell regal with scorpions near the sea, they can do the same to him. Daenerys set her jaw. I will not cower behind my troops. I am a dragon. I will burn their defenses and shatter their lines. Once the fortress is weakened, Grey Worm and the Unsullied can storm it. She paused, scanning the faces in the tent. Tyrion met her gaze, swallowing hard. And if Jon Snow is there? He asked softly. Will you burn him too? Her face twisted with pain, quickly buried. He has chosen to stand against me. If he challenges my reign, then yes, he is no different from any other traitor. Tyrion lowered his eyes. He sensed the final strands of the Queen's compassion unraveling. Outside, the sound of horses and men preparing for battle echoed through the camp. Daenerys turned to Grey Worm. Ready the troops. At dawn, we attack. She then left the command tent, stepping out into the chill air. Drogon was curled in the distance, black wings folded. She moved to him, stroking his scaled flank. The great beast rumbled a low purr, fiery breath steaming the night air. Together, they would face the fortress, face Jon Snow and all who defied her. She told herself again that she had no choice. The realm needed a firm hand, and she was that hand. Dawn broke, a gray veil over the swamps around Moat Cailin. The northern watchmen on the ramparts spotted movement in the distance. The Unsullied forming tight ranks, the Dothraki fanning out. Then a roar echoed across the plains, and Drogon appeared, wings casting a vast shadow. Jon Snow stood atop the walls, grim as the stones beneath his boots. The scorpions were manned, archers stringing bows, spearmen readied. Davos was at his side, biting his lip in worry. Tormund hefted a massive axe, scanning the horizon for the cavalry. Brienne was near the gate with a detachment of knights. Hundreds of men waited, hearts pounding. They heard the horns below, the crash of drums. Daenerys' army surged forward at her command, moving into a formation. Drogon soared overhead in a slow circle, out of range of the scorpions, at least for the moment. Jon turned to Davos. Signal them to hold fire. We wait until the dragon comes closer. Davos nodded, relaying the order. The men gripped their weapons, tension thrumming. Jon scanned the battlefield, hoping for any sign of parley, any white flag. None came. Then, a thunderous roar from Drogon signaled the advance. The Unsullied marched, spears gleaming in the early light. The Dothraki charged from the flanks, hoofs pounding the damp ground. Arrows hissed from the fortress walls, cutting down the first wave of riders. But more poured forth, wild cries echoing across the field. Drogon dived low, spitting flame at a section of the outer defenses. Wooden palisades erupted in blazing ruin, screams filling the air as men were caught in the inferno. Jon shouted commands. Scorpions now! The war machines pivoted, bolts launching into the sky. Drogon wheeled, a bolt clipping his flank, causing him to shriek in pain. Daenerys guided him away, circling for another pass. Fire and arrows crisscrossed the sky, a deadly dance of steel and flame. Below, the armies clashed in brutal melee. The Unsullied advanced with discipline, But the northern defenders had the advantage of walls and battlements. Everywhere was chaos. Men slipped in the boggy ground. Horses crashed into spear lines. Screams and the clang of steel rang out. Daenerys circled again, her heart racing as she looked for a weak point in the fortress. She saw the scorpion that had nearly struck Drogon's heart. A monstrous contraption manned by half a dozen men. With a roar, she directed Drogon to dive. Flames engulfed the scorpion, men scattering like ants. The tower supporting it groaned and collapsed. Arrows from the ramparts peppered Drogon, most bouncing off his scales, but a few finding softer spots near his wings. He roared again in anger. Daenerys felt each strike like a dagger to her soul. She spurred him on, determined to break the fortress's defenses. On the walls, Jon watched in horror as flame and blood ravaged his men. He spotted Daenerys atop Drogon, a vision of wrath, her hair flying behind her. He shouted to Davos, "We can't hold against the dragon for long. We need to drive the Unsullied back, cut off their approach." Davos grimaced. "They're too disciplined, but maybe the Vale cavalry." Before he could finish, a chunk of the wall exploded in flame where Drogon's breath raked it. Stones collapsed, men falling to their deaths. Jon staggered back, coughing from the smoke. Part of the fortress was ablaze. Somewhere in the swirl of battle, Tormund roared a war cry as the free folk ambushed a group of Dothraki. Brienne led knights in a charge, slamming into the Unsullied flank. The fight was ferocious, each side driven by desperation. Daenerys circled for another pass. Archers tried to track Drogon, loosing arrows in vain. At the same time, the main gate was battered by a siege ram carried by the Unsullied. Under the relentless assault, the gate splintered. Grey Worm led the charge inside, where defenders met them in savage hand-to-hand combat. Jon raced down from the walls, forging through the chaos. He caught sight of Grey Worm's helmet, and behind him the standard of House Targaryen. The old memory of them fighting side by side against the dead flashed in Jon's mind, a painful reminder of how far they'd fallen. But there was no time for regret. Jon raised Longclaw, deflecting a spear thrust. He roared, "Hold the gate!" Soldiers rallied around him, forming a tight circle. The fighting was brutal. Grey Worm's spear flashed, taking down 2 defenders, but Jon parried him, forcing the commander back. Eyes locked for a moment. Grey Worm's expression was one of sorrow and anger, as if blaming Jon for Missandei's death and everything that had followed. Above them, Drogon unleashed another torrent of flame along the wall. More screams. The fortress was failing. Jon realized they could not hold much longer. The men were demoralized, battered, pinned between the unstoppable Unsullied and Dragonfire. Jon shouted to Davos, "Sound the retreat! Fall back to the inner keep." A horn blew, signaling the defenders to pull back. The courtyard was choked with smoke, debris, and the bodies of the fallen. As they withdrew, the Unsullied pressed forward. Flames devoured the outer walls. Daenerys hovered overhead, ready to finish them off. She guided Drogon lower, scanning the carnage. She spotted Jon Snow in the courtyard, hair streaked with ash, sword bloody. Her heart twisted. Even now, a part of her screamed that this was wrong, that they had been friends, lovers, but betrayal demanded retribution. She inhaled, about to unleash flame upon him directly, when a scorpion bolt soared from a hidden tower. Tyrion had overlooked a small ballista position that the defenders had placed near the central keep. The bolt struck Drogon's left flank, burrowing deep. Drogon shrieked in agony, lurching wildly. Flame spewed from his jaws, uncontrolled. Daenerys clung to the saddle, terror gripping her. Drogon veered off course, smashing into a section of the burning wall. Stone fragments rained down, crushing Unsullied and Northerners alike. Jon dove aside, feeling the heat of Drogon's flame singe his cloak. Roaring, Drogon managed to lift off again, blood pouring from the wound. Daenerys guided him away from the fortress, struggling to maintain control. She realized if she lost Drogon, she lost everything. Rage boiled in her veins, but she had to protect him. For a moment, she retreated, climbing higher to assess the damage. Below, the fortress courtyard was an inferno. Bodies littered the ground. The defenders reeled, but the attack had been momentarily halted by the chaos. Grey Worm signaled a regrouping. The Unsullied formed ranks amidst the rubble, ready for another push. Jon coughed in the smoke, wiping soot from his eyes. This was carnage. Even if they held the fortress, the cost was staggering. He scanned the skies for Daenerys, half praying she would yield. Instead, he saw Drogon circling again, though slowed. She was going to press the attack, wounded dragon or not. Then, cutting through the smoke, Jon heard a distant horn. Another host was arriving from the northern road. Could it be reinforcements? He peered into the distance. Banners of the Vale and the Riverlands fluttered. More men who had been marching under Sansa's direction, perhaps. Their cavalry streamed toward the battlefield. A fierce wave of hope surged in Jon. If they attacked Daenerys' flank, maybe the Unsullied would break. Maybe the day could be won without further ruin. He signaled to Tormund and Brienne to rally the men. As the new arrivals crashed into Daenerys' lines, confusion reigned. The Dothraki spun to meet the charge, hooves pounding. The Unsullied repositioned, caught between defenders in the burning fortress and fresh attackers to the rear. Daenerys roared in frustration, spurring Drogon into one more pass. The ground below was a sea of chaos, friend and foe colliding. She aimed for the newly arrived cavalry, unleashing a torrent of flame. Horses screamed, men scattered, the rank burned. But her vantage now was lower, and a hail of arrows and bolts rose to meet Drogon. Another scorpion had been positioned among the reinforcements. The bolt whistled through the air, narrowly missing Drogon's wing. Jon seized the opportunity. He rushed forward with a small group of defenders, smashing into the Unsullied flank. This time the line wavered. Grey Worm fought viciously, but the combined assault from both sides was too much. The Unsullied began to retreat out of the courtyard, unable to hold their formation. Daenerys watched in horror as her disciplined troops were pushed back. She felt Drogon weakening beneath her, his flight erratic. Blood streamed from the wound in his side. Another pass might kill him. All around, the moors and fortress were ablaze, corpses strewn across the boggy ground. The stench of death and burning flesh rose to greet her. She had come to break the fortress quickly, but now the battle was devolving into a meat grinder for both armies. She clutched the saddle, tears burning in her eyes. Could she risk Drogon's life in a final push? Or should she call a retreat, regroup? She hovered in the air, scanning the battlefield. Jon was below, drenched in smoke and ash, screaming for the men to press forward. The fortress, though burning, was still held by the north. Reinforcements poured in. The day was slipping away from her grasp. With a furious cry, Daenerys signaled a withdrawal. Grey Worm saw the retreat command from below, rallying the Unsullied to pull back. The Dothraki, hearing the horns, broke off their attack, some cursing the Queen's order, others simply eager to escape the ring of scorpion bolts. They streamed south, forming a rear guard. Jon watched them withdraw, relief and sorrow mixing in his chest. He did not order a chase. Not yet. He saw Drogon struggling to stay aloft as Daenerys guided him away from the battlefield. The Queen's face was contorted, half with rage, half with despair. The battle ended with the cries of the wounded and the crackle of flames devouring Moat Cailin's walls. Northern men rushed to douse the fires or to save trapped comrades. The ground was slick with blood. Bodies lay in heaps, Unsullied and Northmen alike. It was a victory of sorts, but a Pyrrhic one. The cost had been tremendous, and Daenerys was still out there with an army that could fight another day. Jon sank to his knees, exhaustion crashing over him. Davos appeared at his side, face streaked with soot. We held, but at what price? Jon gazed at the devastation. Too high, he whispered. Too high a price. Somewhere in the distance, Daenerys' horns sounded a final retreat. Drogon's roars grew fainter as she vanished into the haze, carrying her fury away. The next clash, Jon knew, would be worse. For each life lost here, Daenerys's hatred would burn hotter. And so the realm's darkest chapter was only beginning. The lines were drawn, the banners raised, and neither side could easily yield. Even as the dead were counted and pyres prepared, a new storm gathered on the horizon, forging a future of dragonfire and icy vengeance. All because a spider dared to speak too soon of the madness in a queen's heart, and a reluctant king found himself thrust into a war he never wanted. A war that threatened to consume them all. Smoke still rose from the ruins of Moat Cailin well into the next day, the fires crackling in the husks of collapsed walls and shattered towers. Dawn revealed the grim tableau of the battlefield. The scorched earth where Drogon's flames had raked across the old fortress, broken scorpions, piles of the dead. Jon Snow had set his men to the sorrowful tasks of digging graves and gathering the wounded into makeshift infirmaries amid the least broken halls. The stench of charred flesh and burned wood clung to everything, defying the morning breeze. He stood on what remained of the ramparts, gazing across the swampy land where Daenerys Targaryen's host had withdrawn. Reports said her forces were pulling back a league or two to set camp. Perhaps they feared the scorpions would strike again if they lingered in range. Scouts had ventured cautiously through the haze at first light, returning with tales of an orderly retreat. Grey Worm had regrouped the Unsullied in a broad clearing. The Dothraki were restless. Some had ridden in circles, howling challenges at the northern outriders, but no second assault came. Not yet. Davos Seaworth joined Jon on the rampart, the old knight cradling his left arm where a shallow cut bled through his bandage. "My lord, or my king, I should say, how many did we lose?" Jon lowered his eyes. "Near 2,000, maybe more. Twice that number wounded. And we slew hundreds of her men as well. All for a ruined fortress." Davos nodded grimly. "A victory, but a costly one. Our scouts tell us she lost fewer, though her dragon is injured." Jon frowned, remembering Drogon's pained shrieks and the way Daenerys had pulled him back from the fray. "A wounded dragon is still a dragon. We won't have the advantage of surprise next time." A breeze licked across the charred stones, stirring ashes. Davos rubbed at the back of his neck. "And next time could be soon. You know her temper. She'll want vengeance." Jon looked out at the fields, where beyond the watery haze of the marshland, Daenerys was somewhere nursing her fury. "We need to hold here, repair the walls if we can. The moat is still our best defensive line." He inhaled slowly. "Send riders to Winterfell. Summon any reserve forces we might spare, and command them to hurry. If Daenerys chooses to press the attack before we've recovered, we may not hold." Davos inclined his head. I'll see to it." Before he left, Jon caught his sleeve. "And Davos, send another letter to Daenerys. Offer terms again." Davos stiffened in alarm. "After all this blood?" Jon's voice was hollow. "Because of all this blood. If there's any chance we can end it without more slaughter." He trailed off, and the lines in his face deepened, burdened by a weight he had never sought. "We owe it to our people to try." Davos exhaled. "As you say, your grace." He departed, leaving Jon alone with his grief. The sun had climbed higher, casting long shadows across the ragged walls, and the swirling smoke glowed faintly in the light. Jon reflected on the last time he had seen Daenerys's face. Wild with anguish as Drogon took that scorpion bolt, stricken fury in her eyes. She might hate him more deeply now. Perhaps the final break between them had come. Yet he could not give up on the hope, even a sliver, that reason could prevail. He descended the crumbling stairway to the courtyard, where rows of the fallen were laid out in neat lines. Soldiers moved quietly among them, pulling cloaks over faces, muttering prayers to the old gods and the seven alike. A hush fell over the fortress, broken only by the crackle of dying fires and the rasp of saws cutting fresh timber to buttress the damaged walls. Tormund Giantsbane emerged from the smoky gloom. The wildling's hair and beard looked singed at the edges, and his eyes were red-rimmed from smoke. He spat onto the ground. "We gave them a fight, Jon Snow? But damned if that lizard didn't nearly roast us all." Jon nodded heavily. "Good men died. I want to make sure their deaths mean something." Tormund clapped him on the shoulder. Then hold this keep, I say. Force the Dragon Queen to waste her strength trying to take it from us. That's the plan. Jon tried to muster a faint nod of appreciation. Get yourself some rest. You fought bravely. The wildling snorted. I'll rest when I'm dead. Always said that. But he did shuffle off in search of a meal or a place to sit, his posture weighed down by the horrors of the night. When Jon walked further into the courtyard, he found Brienne of Tarth organizing the battered knights from the Vale and Riverlands. Their armor was scorched, shields dented, but their discipline held. She was speaking to Lord Royce in hushed, urgent tones, as men staggered by with injuries. The big knight caught sight of Jon and saluted with a curt bow. "How do we stand?" Jon asked. Royce cleared his throat. "We can still muster near 5,000 men fit to fight, plus those reinforcements who arrived mid-battle. We might have had more if the fighting hadn't been so fierce at the gate." Brienne nodded. Her dragon did most of the damage. "But your men manning the scorpions were—" She paused, the memory painful. "They were brave." Jon looked at the battered scorpions, blackened by dragon flame. "One or two might still be salvageable. We'll need every advantage. Grey Worm will reorganize her army. They might attack again as soon as Drogon can fly." Royce and Brienne both agreed. With that, Jon excused them to their tasks and resumed the weary circuit of his duties, stepping past the dying and wounded, accepting grim nods from his men. There was no triumph here, only survival. Afternoon light burned through the high windows of a commandeered manor on the outskirts of the battlefield, where Daenerys Targaryen had established her command post. The structure had once belonged to some minor northern noble centuries ago, but time and disuse had left it partially in ruins, a suitable reflection of the war's ravages. Inside the great hall, Grey Worm stood at attention, spear in hand, helmet off. His face bore shallow cuts, and blood stained the edges of his armor, but his posture remained rigid. Daenerys hovered near the fireplace, arms folded over a bandaged cut on her forearm, courtesy of shrapnel from a collapsing wall. Tyrion Lannister lingered by the table, his expression haunted by what he had witnessed. It seemed only a moment ago he had been traveling the countryside to broker peace. Now war spread like wildfire, and there was no halting it. Daenerys lifted her gaze to Grey Worm. "Casualties?" His voice was low. "We lost perhaps 600 unsullied. Another 300 wounded. Some Dothraki died in the initial charge. The rest are restless. They want to burn the fortress to the ground." Daenerys's eyes flicked with heat. "So do I. But Drogon is hurt. He can still fly, but not as swiftly. A direct assault on those walls again." She paused. Her tone choked. "The next time, they may kill him." Tyrion cleared his throat, stepping forward. "Your Grace, perhaps we should consider a different strategy. If the fortress is too costly to take head-on, we can bypass it. The neck is dangerous, yes, but there may be paths we can exploit. Or even transport some troops by sea, if we can slip past the Ironborn in the area." Daenerys turned to him, and the tension in her posture rippled. "That would take time, and each passing day, the North grows stronger. More lords might join Jon. If we linger, we risk the entire realm turning against me." Tyrion lowered his eyes. "They already have, my queen, at least most who remember your father's reign. This war is convincing them you are indeed the daughter of the Mad King." Her voice cut like a whip. "And whose fault is that, Tyrion? I warned them I would not tolerate treason. Did they listen? I have done what is necessary to secure the throne." Tyrion found no answer. Her anger was a wall he could not breach. Grey Worm stepped in, gaze unwavering. "The men remain loyal, your grace. They remember how you freed them in Essos. The Dothraki remember their Khalasar crossing the poison water with you. They will follow you wherever you lead." She gripped the mantle above the fireplace, as though anchoring herself. "We must end this soon. I cannot allow the 7 kingdoms to remain in rebellion, or else all I've bled for will be lost." Tyrion inhaled, trying once more to speak reason. "We could open lines of negotiation. Jon is no fool, and he's not a man who relishes war. If we propose a settlement, perhaps dividing the realm or—" Her glare silenced him. "Divide the realm? Are you mad? That would shatter the very idea of one kingdom under my rule. I was born to unite these lands, not break them further." She closed her eyes briefly, wrestling with her fury. "No. If Jon will not bend the knee, he forces my hand." A hush followed her words. Tyrion glanced at Grey Worm, but the unsullied commander's expression revealed nothing. At length, Daenerys stepped away from the fireplace, the flickering light turning her hair to white flame. "We will regroup for now. Let Drogon heal as best he can. Then we strike again. I will not give Jon Snow time to gather more men." "Very well, your grace," Grey Worm said. As they turned back to their maps, an unsullied soldier approached with a sealed parchment. He offered it to Daenerys in silence. Tyrion's eyes flicked curiously to the letter. She broke the seal with trembling hands, scanning its contents. Her jaw hardened. "What does it say?" Tyrion ventured. She tossed the parchment onto the table. "Another offer from Jon. He asks for parley and urges that we spare the realm any more slaughter. He claims to want peace for our people." Tyrion cast a glance at the letter. The words were straightforward, written in Jon's earnest style, pleading for negotiations, referencing the countless lost lives. "He's reaching out again. That means something," he said quietly. Daenerys snorted. "Words, Tyrion. Words from a man who calls himself king in the north while defying me. Why should I trust him now?" "Because he's honorable," Tyrion answered softly. "Perhaps too honorable for his own good, but it's the truth." Daenerys' stare remained ice. For a moment, the memory of Jon's eyes, the way he had once looked at her, softened her expression. But it vanished quickly, replaced by a steely resolve. "No. He wants me to abandon my claim. I will not. If I meet him in parley, he'll see that Drogon is wounded. He'll sense weakness. No, tell him there will be no parley. The next time we meet, it will be on the battlefield." Tyrion swallowed the lump in his throat. "As you command, your grace." Daenerys turned away, signaling the conversation was done. A week passed in a tense stalemate. Both armies licked their wounds. At Moat Cailin, carpenters worked day and night to shore up the battered walls with newly felled timber. Repair crews managed to refit 2 scorpions from salvaged parts. Jon's forces swelled slightly as more men trickled in from the north and the Vale. The news of a narrow victory, even a Pyrrhic one, encouraged some lords who had wavered to throw in their lot with Jon Snow. Meanwhile, Daenerys' host remained camped to the south. Rumors trickled in that she was waiting for Drogon's wounds to mend, refusing to risk him in half-strength. Grey Worm tightened discipline among the Unsullied, drilling them daily. Dothraki outriders roamed the surrounding region, raiding farms to feed the horde, scattering small pockets of northern scouts. Tyrion worked to keep the peace in the camp, but he felt his own influence waning with every day that Daenerys chose fire over diplomacy. Ravens flew between the armies, carrying Jon's repeated offers of negotiation and Daenerys' repeated refusals. The realm watched anxiously from afar. Some said Daenerys would burn everything to avenge her father's name. Others whispered Jon Snow might rally all the great houses to trap her in the north. Old hatreds flared, factions formed, violence brewed in the shadows. At Winterfell, Sansa Stark had gathered what remained of the Lady of Winterfell's court. She coordinated supply lines, ensuring grain and salted meat flowed south to feed Jon's army. From the Eyrie, Lord Royce continued sending men, determined to see the Vale stand united against any threat to the north. Gendry Baratheon, newly named Lord of Storm's End, sent cautious messages of support. He remembered Daenerys' help but feared her now, uncertain whether to stand openly with Jon or remain neutral. Yara Greyjoy of the Iron Islands, once a fervent ally of the Dragon Queen, now balked at the idea of fighting the north. But she also did not wish to betray Daenerys fully. Thus, the realm hovered in a morass of indecision, each lord or lady weighing which side would preserve them. On a smoky dawn, when the sun rose orange behind low-hanging clouds, A horn sounded from the southern approach to Moat Cailin. Jon Snow emerged onto the freshly repaired ramparts, scanning the horizon. A small party of riders approached, carrying a white flag. Not Daenerys, Jon could tell that at once. In fact, it seemed the riders were Dothraki and Unsullied escorting Tyrion Lannister himself. At Jon's side, Davos hissed in a breath. "He's come alone, or near enough." Jon nodded. "He must want to speak. Open the gate." They descended to the main courtyard, where men parted warily as Tyrion arrived under heavy guard from both sides. The dwarf dismounted stiffly. He appeared thinner, lines of worry etched deeper around his eyes, hair whipped by the cold northern wind. Beside him stood a pair of Unsullied, who looked ready to fight or flee at the first sign of danger. Jon faced Tyrion with measured calm. "My Lord Hand, this is unexpected." Tyrion took a moment to glance around at the battered fortress. Moat Cailin never looked so battered. "I thought it was ruinous before, but the Dragonfire certainly redecorated." He gave a wry, humorless smile. Jon gestured for Tyrion to follow him inside, into a corridor where curious soldiers would not overhear. The Unsullied shadowed them, while Davos, Tormund, and a few of Jon's trusted men lingered close by. Once they reached an antechamber that had survived the flames, Jon turned to Tyrion. "Why have you come?" Tyrion pressed his lips together. "To see if there's any path to avoid a second battle. The Queen will not negotiate with you as long as you claim the title king in the north. But perhaps there is a compromise. If you agreed to recognize her sovereignty in name, she might permit the north a wide degree of autonomy. You'd remain warden of the north." Jon cut him off, voice restrained but firm. "We tried that once, Tyrion. I bent the knee in good faith, and she threatened to burn my people. She made me watch as she nearly burned King's Landing. She executed Varys for daring to speak his mind. My lords will never accept her as queen now." Tyrion glanced at the Unsullied guards, ensuring they stood out of earshot. They remained by the door, faces impassive. "If you hold firm," he said quietly, "she'll attack again the moment Drogon can fly without pain. Next time, she may not withdraw. She'll keep blasting your walls until none stand." Jon's mouth tightened. "We have no desire to kill her, but we will not be ruled by fear. If she chooses to come again, we'll fight." Tyrion spread his hands, frustration evident. "You know what it means. Thousands more will die on both sides. And if you drive her away again, what then? Will you march on King's Landing? Kill her if she won't surrender." He lowered his voice. "Is that what you want?" Jon's eyes flickered with pain. "I don't want any of this, but I'll do my duty. She won't bend either, you know. She's too proud, too convinced she's destined to rule." They stared at each other, the tension thick. Outside, the wind moaned through the cracks in the old stones. At length, Tyrion sighed. "I hope to find some path forward, some wedge between the two of you. But if you can't renounce your claim, and she can't bear to let you live as a rival, we may be past the point of no return." Jon exhaled slowly. "Is that your official message, then? That she'll come at us again?" Tyrion's voice was strained. "She wanted me to ask you to yield, to come before her and renounce any claim to the throne, to kneel publicly so that the realm sees you submit. She says she might spare the North partial independence if you do. But we both know how that would be received here. If you kneel, your lords will brand you a traitor or a coward, and she'll keep your people under the threat of dragons forever." Jon felt anger stirring in his chest. "She's asking me to abandon everything my people have suffered for, to kneel to her because she thinks it's her birthright. Cannot do that. I won't." Tyrion nodded sadly, as though he had expected no less. "Then she will attack, and the realm will bleed." Jon's stare held Tyrion's. "You could stand aside. You could leave her service. You know she's treading the same path as her father." Tyrion gave a bitter laugh. "As if it's that simple. I swore myself to her cause, broke faith with my own family for her." He hesitated, swallowing. "But you're right. I see the cracks in her armor. I see the madness creeping closer. And yet, I still can't betray her. Not after all that's happened." Not unless she gives me no choice." They were silent a moment, the weight of shared tragedy pressing upon them. Then Jon nodded to the guards, who stepped forward. "Take him safely back," Jon said. "We have no quarrel with Lord Tyrion." As Tyrion turned to depart, Jon spoke again, voice low. "Tell her I'm sorry. Tell her I never wanted war. But we won't surrender. We can't." Tyrion's brow furrowed. "I will tell her, whether it changes anything." He let the words fade. Moments later, Tyrion left under the same white flag, heading south. Jon wondered if it would be the last time they spoke in peace. 3 more days passed in uncertain quiet. Each dawn brought new rumors. Some said Daenerys was on the move, marching west to circumvent the Neck. Others claimed she was mustering the Dothraki for a direct assault. Jon's scouts gave conflicting accounts. The Queen's forces were still at camp, though restless. Her outriders prowled the countryside, burning any farmland that refused to offer supplies. Fear and resentment spread among the local small folk. Many fled north, seeking refuge behind Moat Caelin's battered walls. At last, on a gray and mist-laden morning, horns echoed from the south. Watchmen scrambled to vantage points. Through the thinning fog, countless torches glimmered, forming lines that snaked across the horizon. A dull thunder of hooves rattled the air. The Queen's host was on the march again. Jon donned his armor, the black and gray plates battered from the previous battle. As he buckled Longclaw at his hip, he prayed silently to the old gods that this day would not bring a butchery. His men gathered in the courtyard, armed and grim. The wounded from the previous clash took up bows or crossbows, anything that let them fight from the walls. Scorpions were manned. The tension was suffocating. From the ramparts, Jon watched the unsullied form ranks just out of arrow range. Their precision was terrifying, spears aligned, shields locked, as if each man were part of a single body. Behind them, the Dothraki milled on their horses, ready to unleash a furious charge at any moment. And high overhead, a black shape circled, Drogon. He still flew a bit unevenly, but the scorpion bolt's wound had largely healed. His roars shook the damp air. A hush stretched. Minutes passed with no sign of immediate attack. Then, from the unsullied lines, a single rider trotted forth, a herald carrying a white banner of truce. Confusion rippled through Jon's men. He exchanged puzzled looks with Davos, who stood nearby. "What trick is this?" Tormund growled, half expecting a sudden ambush. Jon called to a sentinel. "Let them approach." The herald rode closer, staying well clear of arrow range. He raised his voice. "Her Grace, Daenerys Stormborn, invites Jon Snow to a final parley. She will await him upon the open field, under the watch of her armies." Anxious murmurs spread through Jon's ranks. Davos said quietly, "Could be a trap." Jon set his jaw. "Or an attempt at peace. Tyrion must have convinced her to try one last time." Tormund muttered. "Parley out in the open, surrounded by her men. She could kill you at her whim." Jon's eyes flicked to the swirling shape of Drogon. "She wouldn't dare break the sacred custom of parley. Not openly." Davos put a hand on Jon's shoulder. "You cannot go alone. She might not kill you outright, but she could take you prisoner." Jon considered that. "I'll take a small guard, but if we show up with too large a force, it might provoke her. Wait here. Keep the scorpions ready, in case it's a ruse." Davos's lips pressed into a thin line. "A fine plan if you come back in one piece." Jon offered a grim nod. "Pray that I do." They rode out under another white banner. Jon Snow, Davos Seaworth, Brienne of Tarth, and half a dozen Northmen, all heavily armed but with weapons sheathed. The mist clung to the fields like a living thing, swirling around the horses' legs. Ahead, Daenerys sat astride Drogon upon a slight rise, Grey Worm at her side on foot, and Tyrion standing a few paces behind. A ring of Unsullied formed a perimeter, while the Dothraki lurked at a distance, weapons gleaming even in the dull light. Jon's heart thudded as he guided his horse forward. He had not seen Daenerys up close since the battle for Moat Cailin. She was dressed in leather and mail, her white silver hair bound back, and though she sat tall in the saddle upon Drogon's shoulders, the lines of exhaustion and grief etched her features. Drogon growled softly, smoke curling from his nostrils. Jon halted his horse a respectful distance away. Davos and Brienne fanned out to flank him. Silence reigned for a beat, broken only by the faint shuffle of men in formation. At last Daenerys spoke. "You came," she said, voice subdued yet carrying an undercurrent of tension. Jon inclined his head. "Your herald said it was a final parley. I'd hear what you have to say." She exhaled, meeting his gaze with a steadiness that held echoes of the woman he once cared for. "I offer you one final chance to bend the knee, a public submission before my army. Should you do so, I will accept your loyalty. The North may keep its ways and its name, but you will answer to me as queen." Jon's jaw tightened. "And if I refuse?" She glanced down at Drogon's black scales. "I will burn Moat Cailin to ash. Then I will press onward until the North is subjugated. You know I have the strength to do it. You've seen what happens when I lose patience." A hot flush of anger and sorrow swirled in Jon's chest. "You would slaughter thousands?" She shook her head. "They would not die if they surrendered. Let them blame you for refusing to submit." Jon let the words settle. Then he took a breath, trying to keep calm. "You speak of subjugation, of forcing men to obey you or die. How is that any different from what your father did?" He saw a flicker of pain in her eyes. Tyrion tensed behind her, as if ready to intervene. But Daenerys answered coldly. "I have fought for the downtrodden all my life. I freed slaves and defeated tyrants. Now I must be strong, so I am not undone by small-minded lords who cling to the past." "Those small-minded lords helped you defeat the Night King," Jon countered. "They bled in your name when you arrived in the North, because they believed in you. And now they betray me," she retorted. "They follow you or they raise arms against me." A flicker of genuine regret passed across Jon's face. He remembered the camaraderie they once had. "Many of them fear your wrath, and they see you making their fears real. You never gave them a chance to love you." Something bitter twisted her lips. "It seems no one in Westeros was willing to grant me that chance unless I bent to their will. But I am a dragon. I do not bend." Jon felt his frustration mounting. "You say you want peace, but all you offer is conquest. There is no peace in that." She stared at him for a long moment. Tyrion watched, tense as a drawn bowstring. Grey Worm stood silently, spear butt on the ground, eyes flicking between Daenerys and Jon. Drogon shifted, letting out a low rumble. Finally, Daenerys' voice emerged, quiet but firm. "There can be no peace while a rival king stands in open rebellion. So I give you this last chance. Renounce your claim, swear your fealty, or be destroyed." Jon closed his eyes, remembering the times he had stood in front of her, hands clasped, speaking of cooperation. All that had withered now. He opened them again and spoke softly. "I will not bend. I swore to protect my people from any threat, even if that threat is you." Pain flickered in her expression, but she masked it swiftly. "Then you have chosen war. I hope you understand what that means." Davos stirred, speaking up for the first time. "Your Grace, if you do this, you'll forever be the queen who burned the North. Even if you win, you lose the realm's love." She leveled him with a glare. "I gave up on their love the moment they betrayed me." Jon felt a final wave of sorrow. He knew there was nothing left to say. "Then we will fight, Daenerys Stormborn." She inclined her head, the wind snatching at stray tendrils of her hair. "So be it." She looked down at Tyrion, who hovered anxiously. "Come," she said, and Tyrion gave Jon a sad glance before following. Drogon spread his wings, the thunder of them pressing Jon's cloak against his body. Grey Worm spared Jon a last, unreadable look, then turned on his heel and marched away with the Unsullied. In a great whirl of wind, Drogon leapt into the air, Daenerys astride, vanishing into the lifting fog. For a moment, the beating of the dragon's wings echoed like a drumbeat over the silent field. Then all was still, save for the pounding of Jon's heart. They returned to the fortress with grim faces. Jon addressed the men, telling them that no peace was possible. The defenders braced for an assault, ensuring every scorpion was loaded, every archer ready. The next few hours stretched painfully, tension thick as the swirling mist. They expected an immediate onslaught. But when midday arrived, there was still no sign of the Queen's army marching forward. Scouts reported the Unsullied forming lines again, the Dothraki massing in the rear. Drogon circled a distance away, as if Daenerys were waiting for something, perhaps calculating where to strike. At last, near Sundo, horns sounded from the southern lines. From the ramparts, Jon glimpsed a flicker of torches. The Dothraki roared, their shrill war cries carrying over the field, and the thunder of hooves echoed like a coming storm. The Unsullied advanced behind them, moving at double time. Above, Drogon shrieked and descended, black wings slicing the sky. A frenzy overtook the defenders. Men rushed to the battlements, ballista operators took aim, and archers knocked arrows. Shouts rang out, "To arms, to arms!" The gates were reinforced. Boiling oil was hauled into place. Drums beat a rapid tattoo, stoking courage in frightened hearts. Then the Dothraki charge emerged from the gloom, a wall of horses and curved blades. The defenders loosed arrows, dropping some riders early. But the Dothraki pressed on, savage and fearless. At the last moment, the ground in front of Moat Caelin's battered walls turned to a muck of churned mud and standing water, hampering the horses. The Dothraki slowed or floundered, losing momentum, and that was when the scorpions fired. Bolts streaked across the twilight. One or two struck Dragonscale. Drogon had swooped too low, eager to unleash flame. He screeched in agony as one bolt nicked his flank, but he powered on. With a roar that shook the earth, he spewed a column of fire upon the ramparts. Men screamed as the flames consumed them. A scorched scorpion fell from the wall, crashed into the courtyard. Jon stood behind the parapet, cloak whipping in the hot wind. Archers, focus on the Dothraki. Let the scorpions handle Drogon. At his signal, a hail of arrows rained down on the riders struggling in the muddy approach. Horses shrieked, toppling. The Dothraki who survived leapt from their saddles and charged on foot, bloodlust in their eyes. Northern spearmen met them at the partially rebuilt gate, and steel clashed in a violent chorus. Meanwhile, the Unsullied advanced in perfect columns, stepping over the bodies of fallen Dothraki. Grey Worm led them, spear in hand, shield poised. They closed in on the fortress's shattered outer wall, the very gap Daenerys had blasted open in the previous battle. Another wave of flames tore across the rampart as Drogon's fury raged. The world became a riot of sparks, embers swirling amid the screams. Up on a platform near the gate, Davos directed a group of crossbowmen to aim upward. Drogon soared overhead, unleashing another torrent of flame that devoured a section of the wall. Boulders and timbers collapsed, crushing friend and foe alike. Yet the defenders persevered. Another scorpion bolt hissed through the air. Drogon dodged at the last moment, the bolt glancing off a scale on his shoulder, though it failed to pierce deeply. Daenerys circled again, determined to finish what she had started. Below, the Unsullied reached the broken walls. A savage fight erupted as Northmen tried to hold the breach with pikes and blades. Jon hurried down from the ramparts, rallying men to seal the gap. He plunged into the thick of combat, Longclaw flashing in the dim, murky light. Bodies pressed around him, the clash of steel on steel vibrating through his arms. The Unsullied fought silently, unyielding, forging deeper into the fortress yard. Grey Worm's spear darted out, toppling a northern soldier. Jon met him head-on, their blades scraping in a shower of sparks. They had clashed once before. This time, the fight was fiercer. Grey Worm moved with lethal grace, his grief and anger fueling every strike. Jon parried desperately, stepping over corpses, forcing himself not to slip in the blood-slick mud. Overhead, the sky glowed orange from Drogon's fire. Suddenly, another scorpion bolt soared up, striking Drogon's side. This time the bolt bit deeper, lodging near his ribs. Daenerys' cry of alarm echoed across the fortress. Drogon veered wildly, flames spurting in a disjointed arc that devoured a tower, then crashed into a corner of the wall. Stones collapsed in an avalanche, burying dozens of combatants on both sides. Jon seized the momentary distraction to slip Grey Worm's guard, kicking him back. Their gazes locked, and for a heartbeat neither moved, both men's faces smeared with blood. Then Grey Worm snarled and lunged again. Jon sidestepped, smashing the pommel of Longclaw into the side of Grey Worm's head. The commander staggered, helmet battered. Jon whirled, but another group of Unsullied pressed in, forcing him to retreat. In the confusion, Tormund and Brienne led a flank attack, slamming into the Unsullied from the side. Grey Worm, disoriented, gave a signal to regroup. The formation tightened, preventing a full rout. The courtyard erupted into a melee of unimaginable violence, men hacking at each other in the smoky half-light. Then came a roar so thunderous it silenced all else. Drogon, wounded gravely by the scorpion bolt, smashed down into the center of the courtyard, his bulk sending men flying. Daenerys clung desperately to the saddle, hair flying wild. Drogon's tail lashed, flattening a stockade of sharpened stakes. His jaws snapped at the nearest foes, spouting flame, but the gout was weaker now, sputtering as blood ran from his wounds. Those nearest the dragon scattered, horrified by the thrashing beast. Jon found himself only 20 paces away, panting, sword raised. The heat rolled off Drogon in suffocating waves, and the stench of burned flesh nearly made him gag. Across the courtyard, Daenerys caught sight of Jon. Even from that distance, he could see the pain and rage twisting her features. For an instant, their eyes locked. In that moment, everything seemed to fall away. Every night spent fighting side by side, every shared loss. 1,000 unspoken words hovered between them. Then reality crashed back in as Drogon roared, snapping his jaws toward a group of Northmen who were too slow to retreat. Daenerys tried to urge Drogon aloft, wanting to escape the courtyard. But the dragon's wings were battered, the scorpion bolt still embedded in his side. He attempted to flap once, twice, each attempt faltering. More archers rushed forward with crossbows and spears, seeking a killing blow. The swirling melee continued around them, but a circle formed as men backed away, uncertain whether to close in or flee from the wounded beast. Jon lunged, shouting for the men to hold. They stared at him, confused. He could see the madness in Daenerys' eyes as she clung to Drogon. She might burn them all in a final act of desperation. Yet the dragon was near spent, each breath coming ragged. Grey Worm, blood trickling down his temple, rallied Unsullied around Drogon, forming a protective barrier. Jon realized they intended to hold off any attackers, to give Daenerys time to escape or regroup. But Tormund and Brienne led a mass of northern spearmen, encircling them. Steel glinted on every side. The ring tightened. Daenerys slid from Drogon's back, landing unsteadily. She stood beside her wounded dragon, eyes wild, her chest heaving. The courtyard was a swirl of chaos, yet it felt as though an invisible circle expanded around them. Jon pushed through the throng, ignoring the weapons pointed at him. Face to face at last, they stared at each other, the ground strewn with bodies, the air swirling with ash. Her voice tore from her throat, raw. "Stay back, Jon." Behind her, Grey Worm brandished his spear at Tormund, daring him to close in. Jon's voice shook with adrenaline. "Dany, it's over. Drogon can't fly. Your army is outnumbered. Surrender now. No more must die." She laughed, a choked, anguished sound. "You think I'd surrender after everything? I am the dragon's daughter. I was born to rule." Blood trickled down Drogon's side, steaming as it hit the cold ground. He growled weakly, lifting his head to glare at the ranks of men closing in. Jon felt the press of soldiers behind him, heard the hiss of arrows being knocked. If they loosed all at once, Daenerys and her dragon would be cut down before they could retaliate. Jon raised a hand to his archers, shouting, "Hold! Don't shoot unless I command it." The men hesitated, uncertain. Brienne barked an order, reinforcing Jon's words. Tormund's men also held back, though their spears remained leveled. Grey Worm bared his teeth, pivoting his spear between the watchers, as though daring them to try. Daenerys' eyes gleamed with a desperate flame. "They'll never let me live. They want me dead," she spat. "Your lords, your allies. I'm the Mad King's daughter to them. A monster." Jon took a cautious step toward her, Longclaw lowered. "If you stand down, I'll spare you. I'll make sure no harm comes to you." She shook her head, tears mingling with sweat and grime on her cheeks. "You can't protect me from their hatred. And how could I live as a prisoner in my own kingdom? No, I'd rather die a queen." Behind her, Drogon rumbled, shifting painfully. A hush fell over the courtyard, as if all the shouting and clashing in the background had faded to a distant din. Jon swallowed, hands shaking. "It doesn't have to be this way," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "Please." She stared at him, and for one heartbeat he saw the old Daenerys, the breaker of chains, the woman who had once been so full of hope. Then her expression hardened, as if a door had slammed shut. She looked at Grey Worm and gave him a single nod. His stance changed. He took 3 swift steps forward, driving his spear at Jon's throat. Jon barely parried in time, metal scraping in a violent clash. Grey Worm pressed in, unstoppable, a flurry of thrusts that Jon answered with frantic footwork. Tormund bellowed and charged, aiming to save Jon, but unsullied soldiers surged forward to intercept. The circle of watchers broke into a melee once again. Jon twisted aside, disarming Grey Worm with a desperate strike that knocked his spear from his hands. Grey Worm responded by drawing a short dagger, slashing in tight arcs. The blade opened a gash on Jon's forearm. Jon hissed, reversing Longclaw to knock the dagger away. They locked eyes, Grey Worm's dark with fury and heartbreak, Jon's filled with sorrow. "Don't make me kill you," Jon pleaded. Grey Worm snarled. "You killed her dreams. You killed Missandei. You killed our queen's hope." He lunged again. Jon sidestepped, pivoted, and with a swift stroke, slammed the pommel of Longclaw into Grey Worm's temple. The unsullied commander collapsed to the ground, unconscious or nearly so. Jon wheeled around in time to see Daenerys place a hand on Drogon's flank, as though urging him to spit one last blaze. The dragon's chest heaved. Men scattered in panic. Jon heard archers drawing back their bows. Another moment, and the courtyard might erupt in mass violence, slaughtering them all. He sprinted toward her, desperate. She saw him coming and raised a hand, tears streaking her face. "Don't come closer," she hissed. He kept going. She stumbled back, searching for a dagger at her hip. Jon closed the distance. Time seemed to slow. He remembered the smell of her hair once. He remembered the way she smiled after the victory at Winterfell. He remembered the moment they both knew he was Aegon Targaryen, and how everything changed after that. In a final surge, he knocked the small dagger from her grasp. She tried to strike him, but her blow was feeble. Grief and exhaustion weighed her down. He wrapped his arms around her, pinning her against him. She struggled, gasping in anger and anguish. "Let me go," she hissed, voice cracking with sobs. "Let me go, Jon." He held her tight, trying to shield her from the myriad weapons pointed their way. Above them, Drogon emitted a feeble roar, black wings trembling. Archers watched, uncertain. Tormund and Brienne subdued the last pockets of unsullied resistance in the courtyard. "No more," Jon said, his voice catching. "Please, no more." She clawed at his chest, tears scorching her cheeks. "They'll never accept me," she whispered, half to herself. "They'll want my blood. And you've taken everything I was meant to have." Jon felt his own eyes burning with tears. "I never wanted this. I never wanted to be king." Their gazes met, raw and exposed. She trembled in his grip, bitterness and heartbreak mingling on her face. For a long moment, the courtyard seemed to hold its breath. Drogon blinked slowly, body heaving. The circle of men edged closer, spears lowered but still ready. Grey Worm lay unconscious, some unsullied kneeling with their hands raised, forced to surrender. Jon slowly released Daenerys, stepping back half a pace. She staggered, glaring at the ring of armed men. Hatred and despair churned within her, like a caged animal. Every part of her screamed to fight on. But Drogon was dying. Grey Worm was down. The Dothraki had either fled or lay slaughtered. Her last hope for total victory had slipped away. Brienne of Tarth stepped forward, sword drawn. Tormund closed in from another side. Davos moved to Jon's flank, breathing hard, crossbowmen behind him. The broken fortress walls loomed, and the thick stench of blood lay over everything like a shroud. She raised her chin, tears still welling. "You would cage me, then? Or kill me as your prisoner?" Jon's voice was soft. "I swear on my honor, if you yield, you'll live. I'll see to it personally. No harm will come to you unless you harm others." He paused, eyes flicking to Drogon. The beast let out a weak hiss. "We'll treat Drogon's wounds if we can. Let this end." She stared at him, a storm raging behind her eyes. The hush stretched into eternity. Then, with trembling hands, she sank to her knees beside Drogon, resting a hand on his massive skull. She pressed her forehead against his scales, eyes squeezing shut. Sobs racked her body, but no sound escaped her parted lips. Jon nodded to Davos, who warily motioned for the archers to lower their bows. Men eased out of striking stances, though tension still thrummed in the courtyard. Brienne looked to Jon for a command, and Jon gave the slightest shake of his head. Daenerys lifted her face, tears carving paths through the grime on her cheeks. She gazed around at the battered fortress yard, at her fallen soldiers, the fearful stares of the Northerners. Tyrion Lannister appeared amid the wreckage, limping forward, expression stricken beyond words. He saw Daenerys kneeling beside Drogon, saw Grey Worm unconscious in a pool of blood. There was no triumph in his eyes, only grief. She finally spoke, voice hollow, "I yield." Jon let out a breath he did not realize he'd been holding. A wave of relief washed over the courtyard, though it mingled with confusion. Could it truly be over? Somewhere in the fortress, a war horn blew, a single long note. The sun had begun to sink, painting the blood-soaked stones in shades of red and gold. Daenerys closed her eyes, stroking Drogon's scales. Jon stepped closer, hand outstretched as if to comfort her. Tyrion reached them as well, glancing from Daenerys to Jon, at a loss. Her voice came again, trembling with defeat and heartbreak. "I was supposed to save them," she whispered. "I came here to break the wheel, to free the people." Jon knelt beside her, his voice a broken rasp. "I know," he said, though he wasn't sure if he believed it anymore. "We can still build something better, if we stop fighting." She gave him a look that was part anguish, part lingering fury. But she didn't resist as Brienne and Davos approached with cautious steps. Gently, as if fearing a sudden burst of violence, they helped Daenerys to her feet, removing the battered remnants of armor from her shoulders. Tyrion hovered close, tears glistening in his eyes. Drogon let out a final anguished breath, slumping onto the rubble. Men inched away, half expecting him to lash out. But he only shuddered, his wings drooping. A keening note escaped Daenerys' lips as she realized how grave the dragon's injuries were. Though not dead yet, Drogon was grievously wounded, blood pooling beneath him. Archmesters might have methods to treat a dragon, but no one here knew them. All they could do was watch as the living symbol of Targaryen power lay broken. Jon motioned for his men to let Daenerys remain by Drogon's side. She sank to her knees again, brushing her hand gently across the dragon's muzzle, murmuring soft words in High Valyrian. Tyrion and Grey Worm, if he recovered, would be placed under guard. But for now, no one had the heart to tear her away from the dying creature. Around them, the courtyard was hushed save for the groans of wounded men and the crackle of a few remaining fires. The lumps of the dead were strewn everywhere, unsullied, Northmen, Dothraki. Some had begun the grisly work of piling corpses. Others simply stared, stunned by how swiftly the tide had turned. Jon rose slowly, the full weight of what had happened pressing down upon him. The Targaryen queen was defeated. The war was won, or so it seemed, though at a terrible cost. How many had died? How many families had been shattered by this madness? Tormund stepped over, a shallow cut across his brow. He glanced at Daenerys, then back to Jon. "So it's done, is it?" Jon looked at him wearily. "Aye, she's yielded. We'll need to decide what happens next." He glanced at Tyrion, who stood with shoulders slumped, eyes full of regret. "But for now, see to the wounded, start the pyres for the dead, and ensure none of our men harm her." Tormund nodded, then set about giving orders, corralling the shell-shocked warriors. As the last light of day bled into dusk, Jon Snow stared at the broken queen, her dragon dying by inches at her side. He remembered the countless times he had tried to bridge the chasm between them, to keep her from the path of wrath. In the end, only the blood of thousands had forced her to lay down her crown. The knowledge weighed on him like a mountain. His men called him Your Grace, some whispering that he was now the undisputed king in the north, perhaps in all Westeros. But as he gazed upon the scene, Jon felt only a profound sadness. He had never wanted the throne. He had wanted to save lives, to avert this very tragedy. Yet, in the Game of Thrones, good men so often found themselves stained with blood. Night drew its curtain, cloaking the ruins in darkness. Torches flared in the courtyard, revealing men in hushed conversation, sorting friend from foe, living from dead. Daenerys still knelt beside Drogon, her face streaked with soot and tears, whispering words lost to the wind. No one dared approach her. Even in defeat, the remnants of her power and sorrow were immense, forming a barrier of grief that none wished to cross. Jon walked among the wounded, offering what reassurances he could, but in his mind, he saw only the final flickers of that monstrous chaos. A single question echoed through his thoughts. Could there have been another way? He thought of Varys, dead before the war began in earnest, trying to warn the realm. He thought of Tyrion, trapped between loyalty and conscience. He thought of Daenerys, shaped by destiny and heartbreak, now brought to her knees in the muddy ruins of Moat Cailin. At last, he retired to a corner of the fortress that still had a partial roof, found a place to sit, and pressed his back against cold stone. Outside, the low moans of wounded men mingled with the soft crackle of the fires. The smell of death hung heavy on the night air. He closed his eyes, head bowed. The realm was safe from dragonfire, at least for now, but the scars of this war would run deep. Tomorrow, he and the Northern Lords would have to decide Daenerys' fate, and likely the fate of the entire realm. Did they execute her as a war criminal, or hold her as a hostage, or exile her across the sea? None of those options felt right, yet he sensed that nothing could truly fix what had been shattered. The night was long and sleepless. When dawn came, pale and cold, Jon found himself walking the courtyard again, stepping over rubble and cinders. He spotted Tyrion kneeling beside Grey Worm, who had been bound and tended for a head wound. Nearby, a knot of Unsullied, disarmed and guarded, refused to leave their commander's side. Daenerys, exhausted, had finally collapsed at Drogon's flank, slumping against his motionless body. Sometime in the night, the dragon had gone still, no longer breathing. She rested her forehead on his scales, as though refusing to let him go. Jon approached slowly. The few Unsullied still free glared at him, but offered no violence. Daenerys didn't stir. He knelt down and placed a hand on her shoulder, gently. She looked up at him, eyes puffy and red. For a moment, he thought she would spit curses, but all fight had drained from her. "He's gone," she whispered. "My child." Jon bowed his head. "I'm sorry." The words felt pathetic in the face of her despair, but they were all he had. She let out a shuddering breath, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. "I have nothing left. My dragons, my armies, my throne. Her gaze flicked up at the blackened sky. I was going to remake the world. Now I'm just another broken soul in the ashes. Jon closed his eyes. We'll find a way forward, somehow. If you truly wanted to break the wheel, maybe this is a chance to build something new, without dragons and fire. She gave a bitter laugh that caught in her throat. A dream that ends in blood. It's always blood. He helped her stand. She swayed, but he steadied her. Soldiers looked on warily, uncertain if the queen remained a threat. With Drogon dead, her last vestige of power seemed extinguished. She was just a woman now, haunted by the ghosts of her ambition. Take her to a secure room, Jon said to Davos and Brienne. No shackles unless she tries to flee or harm someone. Brienne nodded, her expression one of pity rather than triumph. Daenerys let herself be led away, glancing back once at Drogon's body, tears brimming anew. Then she was gone, escorted into the battered halls of the fortress, followed by a half-dozen loyal Unsullied who refused to leave her, even in captivity. The courtyard filled with uneasy stirrings. Tormund approached, wiping soot from his beard. So, we have a queen prisoner. Will she face the headsman's axe? Some of the lords will want that. Jon stared at the ground. I know, but I won't murder her. Not unless she makes it impossible to keep her alive. For now, we hold her. Summon the lords who remain. We'll convene as soon as possible. We have to decide the future of the North and the realm. Tormund nodded. You'll be king, though. After this, who else would they choose? Jon felt a hollow pang. Let's see what the lords say. I've no taste for crowns. But even as he spoke, men in the courtyard were already chanting his name. Some called him King in the North, others Aegon Targaryen, as if the truth of his birth now sealed his dominion. He felt no triumph in their cries, only the looming weight of a duty that had claimed him from the moment he learned the secret of his parentage. He turned away, leaving the rubble of the courtyard behind him, stepping through the battered gate into the open plain beyond. The sky was clouded, a pale gray gloom pressing down. The stench of corpses made his stomach churn. The raw wind stung his eyes. He realized, in that moment, that the path to peace would be long and fraught. Even with Daenerys defeated, the realm was fractious. Some might wish to avenge her, others would call for her head, and others yet might see this as an opportunity to break away from any central rule at all. Yet he could do only what was in his power. Keep his people safe, honor the dead, and cling to the scraps of hope that one day this land might know something other than war. Even if he had to sacrifice everything, he was to see it through. He had lost friends, lost love, lost faith in easy answers. But he still had a duty to the living. A cold gust rippled across the field, ruffling the banners that hung in tatters from Moat Caelin's ramparts. Jon gazed at that battered keep one final time before trudging back inside. His men parted to let him pass, saluting him with respect, relief, and sorrow in their eyes. The war was done, though not without ravages. Somewhere in the depths of the fortress, Daenerys would soon awaken to a new reality. A prisoner in the land she once sought to rule with fire and blood. Tyrion, Davos, Tormund, Brienne. Together they would need to shape a future from these ashes. Whether that future would prove any kinder than the past was an open question. But perhaps, through heartbreak and ruin, they might learn to avoid repeating the same deadly cycles of ambition and vengeance. Jon Snow climbed the winding steps to the Old Lord's chamber that now served as a council room. Before him lay endless decisions. How to handle the remnants of Daenerys' forces, how to appease or pacify rebellious lords, how to feed a realm scarred by war. Yet if he had learned anything, it was that leadership meant carrying the burdens no one else would bear. And so he would shoulder them because he must. Far below, men began to gather the bodies for burning. Unsullied bowed their heads over Grey Worm, who was carried to a makeshift infirmary. The final dragon, Drogon, lay motionless in the courtyard, silent testament to the Targaryen dream that had once set the world aflame. The embers of war still glowed, but the dragon's roar had ended. In the hush, the memory of Varys' dire warnings lingered like a specter, reminding Jon that sometimes the realm needed saving even from its would-be saviors. And so, with dawn's pale light creeping through shattered stones, he prepared to do what he had always done: protect the living as best he could, and hope that, at last, the realm might find room to heal.